In the early months of 1823, roughly 250 British settlers stood on a beach on the Caribbean coast of Central America and looked for a city that did not exist. They had paid for land there. Some had sold farms in Scotland to buy it. They carried deeds, signed and sealed, to plots in a capital called St. Joseph, a city they had read about in a 300-page guidebook. Broad boulevards, a domed cathedral, a theatre, a parliament building, banks along a river running with gold-bearing sand. Among them were a shoemaker who had been appointed official shoemaker to the Princess of Poitiers, a City of London clerk commissioned as an officer in the Poiesian army, and a banker carrying a commission to manage the Bank of Poitiers. There was no city, there was no parliament, no cathedral, no bank, no road, no clearing. There was jungle, mangrove swamp, and a stretch of shore where an earlier English attempt at settlement had rotted back into the trees decades before. The rainy season was beginning. The nearest European settlement was several days away by sea, and nobody there was expecting them. Of the 250 or so who sailed, fewer than a third would come home. They had been sold a country. Not a bad investment in a real country. A country. Its flag, its currency, its constitution, its offices of state, its land registry, and its national debt had all been invented by one Scotsman and sold in London to people who checked as carefully as anyone in 1822 knew how to check. His name was Gregor MacGregor. And this is the story of what remains the most audacious financial fraud ever attempted: the invention, sale, and slow public death of the Republic of Poitiers. And before we go further, a word about why this story sits on a British History Channel rather than in a curiosity cabinet. Poitiers was not an eccentric episode at the margins of the London market. It was floated by a London banking house, listed on the London Stock Exchange, sold to British families through British newspapers, and it happened at the height of a boom in which Britain exported more capital faster to less well-understood places than at any previous point in its history. The country that would spend the next century as the world's banker was, in 1822, still learning what that involved. And Poitiers is the most expensive single tuition fee it ever paid, measured in lives rather than pounds. It is a story with 4 things this channel cares about. A mechanism nobody had used before or has quite matched since. Not a false company, but a false sovereign. A bond issue in a fictional nation's name, traded on the London Stock Exchange alongside the real debt of real countries, a body count, and an ending that will make you put your head in your hands. Because of everyone in this story, the man who did it is the one it worked out for. Start with the man, because the strangest thing about MacGregor is how much of him was real. He was born in 1786 into a Highland family with a genuine and colourful pedigree, a grandson of a soldier known as Gregor the Beautiful, and a clan connection to Rob Roy MacGregor that he would deploy for the rest of his life. At 16, he bought a commission in the British Army. He served in the Peninsular War under Wellington's command structure, though not with distinction, and left after a series of disputes with fellow officers that suggest a man who could not tolerate being ranked. Then, in 1811, he did something unusual. He sold up and sailed for Venezuela to join the wars of independence against Spain. And here is where the honest account gets complicated, because his South American career was not fraudulent. He fought, genuinely and at times very well, under Francisco de Miranda and then Simón Bolívar. He married a cousin of Bolívar's. He led a retreat across country under pursuit that contemporaries and later historians alike judged a genuinely skillful feat of arms. He was made a general. Whatever else he became, MacGregor spent a decade as a real soldier in a real revolution, and the medals were earned. That matters enormously for what follows, and it is the first lesson of this episode arriving early. The most effective frauds are not built by outsiders inventing a life. They are built by insiders spending a real reputation. MacGregor did not need to fake being a general, he was one. Everything he sold in London was underwritten by a career that would survive any check a London investor could actually perform. Then, in 1820, he acquired the thing that turned a soldier into a country. On the Mosquito Coast, the eastern shore of what is now Nicaragua and Honduras, lived the Mosquito people, whose leaders had held a long, semi-formal relationship with the British Crown, styling themselves kings and receiving British recognition of a sort. In April 1820, at a meeting attended by a good deal of rum, King George Frederick Augustus I granted MacGregor a tract of territory, something in the region of 8 million acres along the Black River. Now, hold this carefully because it is the hinge of the entire deception. The grant was, in some meaningful sense, real. There was a document. There was a chief with a plausible claim to grant it, whose predecessors had made similar grants to Britons before. MacGregor did not forge his title. What he did was describe it. The land itself was undeveloped tropical coast, dense forest, swamp, seasonal flooding, endemic malaria and yellow fever, and no infrastructure of any kind. The British had tried a settlement in the region in the previous century. It had failed and been abandoned, and its remains were quietly rotting in the undergrowth. Every fraud this channel has covered contains a kernel of truth that makes the whole edifice checkable. Enron had a real gas business. The railway Mania had real railways. Overend Gurney had a real Quaker name. Poyes had a real land grant from a real king, and it was that single verifiable fact, a document a London solicitor could examine and pronounce genuine, that carried everything else. Because what MacGregor built on top of it was pure invention, and the scale of the invention is what makes this story unique in the history of fraud. He did not sell an investment in a scheme. He constructed a functioning fictional state and sold citizenship in it. Poyes had a name and a flag. It had a constitution and a system of government, with MacGregor as Cazique, a Mosquito-derived title he rendered into English as prince-like ruler, carefully avoiding king so as not to give offence in London. It had a civil service with named departments. It had a land registry issuing deeds by the acre. It had an army with regiments and uniforms. It had a legation in London, a physical office with staff issuing papers to prospective emigrants. It had a currency. MacGregor had Poyesian dollars printed by a genuine Scottish banknote printer, and settlers were encouraged to exchange their British pounds for them before departure, which is a detail worth sitting with, because it meant many arrived on that beach holding money that had never been legal tender anywhere on earth. And it had a book. In 1822, there appeared in London a handsome volume of some 350 pages, a sketch of the Mosquito shore, including the territory of Poyas, by one Thomas Strangeways, captain of the 1st Native Poyer Regiment and aide-de-camp to His Highness the Cacique. Captain Strangeways did not exist. The book was MacGregor's, in whole or substantial part. It is a masterpiece of its kind, and its method is worth studying, because it is the method of every convincing fabrication since. It does not oversell. That is the first thing a modern reader notices. A crude forger would have written a paradise. Strangeways writes a sober regional survey, complete with tedious passages on soil composition, rainfall tables, the customs of neighboring peoples, and, crucially, the drawbacks. The book warns that the work will be hard, that settlers must be industrious, that certain areas are less suitable. It reads exactly like the honest reports of real colonies, because the man writing it had read a great many of them. Into that dull, credible frame he then set the details that sold the country. The climate so healthy that British soldiers stationed there had recovered from illnesses contracted at home, soil producing 3 maize harvests a year. Water in the rivers carrying gold in commercially interesting quantities, forests of mahogany, fisheries. Friendly and industrious natives willing to work for wages who would greet British settlers with enthusiasm. And a capital, St. Joseph, already built and populated by some 2,000 people, with paved streets, a cathedral, a theatre, a domed rotunda, a bank of Poyer, and a detail of real genius, the observation that the town was rather short of tradesmen, so that a skilled artisan emigrating now would find himself in immediate demand. That last touch is the fraudster's signature. It does not merely describe an opportunity, it explains why the opportunity has not already been taken. Every convincing scheme, in every era, must answer the question, if this is so good, why is it available to me? And Poyes answered it perfectly. The country was real, developed and prosperous, but new, and it needed people. MacGregor then monetized his invention along every axis a real state possesses. He sold land, initially at around 1 shilling and 3p an acre, rising as demand grew on printed certificates. He sold offices, commissions in the Poyesian Army and Navy, posts in the civil service, judicial appointments and honours. A London clerk could become a colonel. A shoemaker could become official shoemaker to the princess. These were sold cheaply, and they did double duty. They raised money, and they gave the purchaser a stake in believing. And then, in October 1822, he did the thing that separates Poyes from every other fraud in this series. He issued sovereign debt. Through the respectable London banking house of Sir John Perring, Shaw, Barber and Company, the government of Poyet floated a loan of £200,000 at 6%, secured on the revenues of the country, the customs duties, the land sales, the gold. The bonds were issued in the standard form, with the standard coupons, and they were listed and traded on the London Stock Exchange, alongside the debt of Colombia, Chile, Peru and Mexico. Say that plainly, because it is almost too strange to absorb. For a period in the 1820s, the sovereign bonds of a country that did not exist were bought and sold on the London market, at prices, by professional investors, in the same room and by the same men who traded the debt of real nations. Which raises the question this whole episode exists to answer. How? The answer has 3 parts, and all 3 recur in every bubble this channel covers. First, the information vacuum. In 1822, there was no way for a London investor to check Poyais. Central America was 6 to 10 weeks away by sail. There were no telegraphs, no consular reports on the Mosquito Coast, no reference works a clerk could consult, and, critically, no reason to expect one. The region genuinely was poorly mapped and thinly documented. An investor doing his honest best could examine the land grant, which was genuine, consult the guidebook, which was thorough, verify MacGregor's military record, which was real, observe the London legation, which existed, and note that a respectable banking house was handling the loan. Every check available returned sound. That is the deepest and most uncomfortable lesson here, and we will come back to it. Due diligence is not a search for truth. It is a search through the available records, and a sufficiently ambitious liar can manufacture the records. Second, the moment. Poyais did not appear in a vacuum. It appeared at the peak of a genuine mania and rode it. Between 1822 and 1825, the newly independent states of Latin America came to London in a queue: Colombia, Chile, Peru, Mexico, Brazil, Guatemala, issuing bonds to a British public flush with post-war capital, and desperate for yield above the 3% available on government consols. Mining companies for South American silver were floated by the dozen. It was, in every structural sense, the railway mania 30 years early and 6,000 miles away, and it ended the same way in the crash of 1825, which took down dozens of country banks and forced the Bank of England into the rescue operations that made its reputation, as viewers of our Overend Gurney episode will recall. Inside such a boom, a new Central American country seeking capital was not an anomaly. It was the 14th one that year. The mania supplied Poyais with camouflage. MacGregor's genius was not in inventing a country, but in inventing it precisely when London had stopped finding new countries surprising. Third, and this is the part usually missed, MacGregor was selling to two different audiences with two different weaknesses, and each validated the other. To the city he sold bonds, a financial instrument bought by men who never intended to go anywhere, whose only question was yield and security. To ordinary families he sold land and offices, a life bought by people who intended to sail. And each group took the other as evidence. The settlers reasoned that if the London Stock Exchange was pricing Poyaisian debt, the country was obviously real. The bondholders reasoned that if hundreds of hard-headed Scottish families were selling their farms to emigrate there, the country was obviously real. Neither group knew that both were looking at the same man's imagination. That is a structure worth naming, because it recurs. When two independent-seeming groups each cite the other's participation as proof, the appearance of consensus can be manufactured by one actor standing behind both. It is the oldest trick in confidence work, executed here at national scale. Before the ships, two more pieces of the machine deserve examination: the money that flowed back and the peculiar sales operation that filled the passenger lists. Take the bonds first, because there is a detail in them that separates MacGregor from an ordinary swindler. The 1822 loan raised something in the region of £200,000, a very large sum, though not the largest of that season's Latin American issues. And MacGregor did with it exactly what a genuine sovereign borrower would have done, which is to say, he serviced it. For a period, The coupons on Poyasian debt were paid. Think about what that means mechanically. Interest on the bonds was paid out of the proceeds of the bonds and the land sales, new money arriving, recycled to earlier investors as though it were revenue from a functioning country. If that structure sounds familiar, it should. It is the same arithmetic as Hudson's dividends out of capital in our Railway Mania episode. And the same arithmetic Madoff ran on a vastly larger scale a century and a half later. Paying the coupon is what buys the time because a bond that pays looks like a country that earns. There is a second reason it mattered here specifically. Every quarter that Poyasian coupons were met was a quarter in which the London market had documentary evidence, real payments into real accounts from a real paying agent, that the revenues described in the prospectus were arriving. It was the strongest possible corroboration of the fiction, and it was manufactured with the victim's own capital. Now the sales operation, which was, in its way, more impressive than the bonds. McGregor did not simply advertise. He built a recruitment apparatus with the texture of a real emigration scheme. There were regional agents on commission across Scotland, men who were themselves often sincere believers, which is important because a salesman who has been deceived sells with a conviction no liar can counterfeit. There was the London legation with its staff and its papers. There were printed application forms, land certificates issued in sequence with a registry number, and letters of appointment on headed paper for those buying offices. And there was the crucial psychological device, scarcity with a deadline. Land in the desirable districts around St. Joseph was, prospective emigrants were told, going fast. The good plots near the capital would be taken by the earlier ships. The price per acre was raised more than once during the campaign, which functioned as proof of demand. Nobody wanted to be on the third boat and get the swamp, a fear that turned out, in the bleakest possible way, to be well-founded. That combination, sincere intermediaries, official-looking documentation, rising prices and a closing window, is the standard architecture of high-pressure selling, and McGregor assembled it in 1822 without any of it having a name yet. There is one more element, and it is the darkest touch in the whole design. He encouraged settlers to convert their savings into Poyasian dollars before embarking at a rate he set. Consider what that achieved. It stripped the emigrants of any means of buying passage home or supplies on arrival, ensuring they were wholly dependent on a country that did not exist. It converted their remaining wealth into paper that cost him almost nothing to print. And it removed, at a stroke, the possibility that a settler might land, see the situation, and simply pay a passing captain to take him back to Belize. Whether McGregor thought that far ahead is unknowable, and is one of the genuine open questions his biographers argue over. But the effect was to strand them, and it is the single hardest detail in this story to read charitably. So the settlers came. They were overwhelmingly Scottish. McGregor recruited hard in Edinburgh and the Highlands, where his clan name carried weight and where emigration was already a familiar answer to hard times. They were not the desperate poor. They were the respectable middling sort. The people with something to sell, skilled tradesmen, farmers, small merchants, a doctor, a lawyer, clerks. Several were substantially invested, men who had liquidated everything in Scotland to buy Poyasian acres and take up Poyasian offices. The first ship, the Honduras packet, sailed from London in September 1822 with about 70 aboard. The second, the Kennersley Castle, left Leith in January 1823 with close to 200. There was a send-off. There was cheering. The Honduras packet reached the Mosquito Coast in late 1822 and put its passengers ashore near the mouth of the Black River, where the guidebook placed the approaches to St. Joseph. What happened next is documented in survivors' accounts, and it is, in its quiet way, one of the most desolate passages in the history of British emigration. They found no port. They found no town. They walked and searched and found the overgrown remains of the abandoned earlier settlement, a few collapsed structures being taken back by the forest. They assumed at first that they had been put ashore at the wrong place. The ship's captain, having discharged his contract, sailed away. When the Kennersley Castle arrived some months later and landed 200 more people in the same place, the two groups compared documents and arrived slowly at the only remaining explanation. Then the rains came, and then the fever. The Mosquito Coast in that season is a malarial environment, and these were people with no acquired resistance, no shelter beyond improvised huts and tents, no medical support beyond one doctor's bag, and supplies calculated for a short passage to a functioning town. Malaria and yellow fever moved through the camp. The doctor died. Several settlers, it is recorded, took their own lives, among them the London banker who had come out to run the Bank of Poyes. We will not dwell further, and there is a reason for the restraint. This is a story about a financial mechanism, and the people on that beach are not colour for it. What matters is the arithmetic, stated once, plainly, of roughly 250 settlers who sailed for Poyes. Something in the region of 180 are believed to have died. Fewer than 50 ever saw Britain again. Rescue came by accident. A passing schooner carried word to British Honduras, Belize, and the authorities there sent a vessel. The survivors, most of them too ill to stand, were evacuated to Belize, where many more died. A remnant was eventually carried home to Britain, arriving in the autumn of 1823 to a country that had, by then, begun to understand what had happened. There is a detail from the aftermath that deserves recording because it is the only redemptive thing in the entire episode. The superintendent at Belize and the small British community there took in several hundred desperately ill strangers who had no claim on them, no money that anyone would accept, and no government willing to acknowledge responsibility. They organized medical care, food, and eventually passage home. Nothing in the story of Poyes was competently arranged except the rescue, and that was arranged by people who had never heard of the place until the survivors arrived. And now the part of the story that turns it from a tragedy into a study of accountability, because you would expect this to be where MacGregor is destroyed. He was not in Britain. As the survivors were dying, he had left for France, and by the time the truth reached London, he was beyond reach of any immediate consequence. What he did next is genuinely difficult to believe. In Paris, in 1825, he did it again. He established a new operation, secured backing from a French company, and began recruiting settlers for Poyes, the same invented country, marketed to a French public that had not read the British newspapers. This time, the plot was undone by bureaucracy rather than by conscience. A suspicious French official noticed that a great many passports were being sought for a destination he could not find in any atlas, and the authorities intervened before the ships sailed. MacGregor was arrested and tried in France in 1826 on charges relating to the fraud. He was acquitted. The French court, wrestling with a set of facts no legal system had been designed for, could not satisfactorily establish the crime. Was it fraud to describe a territory to which one held a genuine grant? Which specific misrepresentation on which document to which victim constituted the offence? The prosecution struggled. The case was muddied and MacGregor walked out of the courtroom. He returned to London and, with a persistence that is almost admirable if you can forget the beach, continued to work variations on the scheme for another decade. Fresh Poyassian land certificates were issued in 1827. Another loan was attempted in the 1830s. Each attempt was smaller and less successful than the last, as the story became better known, but none of them landed him in a British dock. And there was no British prosecution, ever. That fact deserves a moment because it is not an oversight. It is the same gap this channel has now documented in 4 centuries. Fraud law in 1820s. Britain was rudimentary. There was no securities regulation, no prospectus law, no offence of issuing a misleading offering document. The victims were scattered, mostly ruined, many dead, and the survivors had every reason to want the humiliation forgotten rather than rehearsed in court. Some of them, remarkably, continued to defend MacGregor publicly, insisting that the cacique had been deceived by his own agents, that the failure lay with the settlers' unpreparedness, that the country would yet be built. That is not stupidity. That is the mind protecting itself from the size of what it has lost, and it appears in the aftermath of nearly every large fraud. It is worth asking what happened to the bonds, since they were the instrument that made this a financial story rather than merely a colonial disaster. They did what the debt of a non-existent country must eventually do. They stopped paying and became worthless paper. But note the cover they had. The great Latin American loan boom collapsed in the crash of 1825, and the debt of Peru, Colombia, Chile, Mexico, and Guatemala went into default alongside Poyes. Real countries stopped paying at the same moment the imaginary one did. That is a genuinely disquieting fact, and it is worth sitting with. For a period in the mid-1820s, a London investor holding Poyesian bonds and one holding Peruvian bonds were in materially the same position, unpaid, holding paper on a distant government they could not reach, with no realistic prospect of enforcement. The fiction was indistinguishable from the reality, not because Poyes was well disguised at that point, but because the reality had become as unrecoverable as the fiction. When a whole asset class fails together, the fraud within it is camouflaged by the honest failures around it, and the losses look like market conditions rather than crime. MacGregor's ending is the detail that makes people put the book down. In 1838, he moved to Venezuela, the country he had genuinely helped to liberate a quarter of a century earlier. He applied for restoration of his rank and citizenship, submitting his service record. The Venezuelan government considered it and granted it. He was confirmed as a general of division, with back pay and a pension, and lived out his years in Caracas as a respected veteran of the Wars of Independence. He died there in December 1845, and was buried in Caracas Cathedral with full military honors, the funeral attended by government ministers and the president himself. 2 questions remain before the lessons, and both are more interesting than they first appear. The first is the one everybody asks. Did he believe it? It is tempting to assume pure cynicism, and the Poyasian dollars argue for it. But his biographers are genuinely divided, and the case for partial self-deception is not weak. Consider the pattern of his life. He had spent a decade among men who were quite literally inventing countries. Bolivar and Miranda were creating republics out of colonies, drawing borders, designing flags and constitutions for states that did not yet exist. In that world, a general with a land grant declaring a nation was not obviously mad. It was the going business of the continent. Several of MacGregor's contemporaries attempted comparable, if smaller, private colonization schemes. And there is the fact that he kept going. A pure calculator, having extracted the money and seen the survivors return, would have stopped, changed his name and enjoyed the proceeds. MacGregor tried Poyet again in France, then again in London, then again in the 1830s, each time with diminishing returns and increasing personal risk. That is not obviously the behavior of a man running a con. It has the flavor of a man who could not let go of a country he had come to inhabit. The most credible reading, and the one this channel will offer without insisting on it, is that both were true and the proportions shifted. The grant may have begun as a genuine, if wildly over-optimistic, colonial venture. The guidebook's inventions were then required to raise the capital to make it real. And once settlers were sailing toward a city he knew was not there, the distinction between believing and lying had ceased to matter to anyone standing on that beach. Which brings the second question. Why did nobody check? Not the settlers. They had no means. But London had means. There were merchants trading to the Caribbean, naval officers who knew the Mosquito Coast, and the Admiralty's own charts. Somebody in that city could have said, within a week, that there was no town of 2,000 people at the mouth of the Black River. The answer is that nobody was assigned to. This is the structural point, and it survives the 2 centuries between then and now intact. In a boom, the incentive to verify is inversely proportional to the appetite to participate. The banking house earning fees on the loan had no reason to commission an investigation that might kill it. The newspapers carrying the emigration advertisements had no reason either. The agents were paid on commission. The prospective settlers were not equipped. And the one group with both the knowledge and the motive to expose it, rival promoters floating competing Latin American ventures, were busy floating their own and had every reason not to invite scrutiny of the general category they were all selling. A market where everyone profits from the story and nobody is paid to test it will not test it. That is not a moral failing of the individuals involved. It is an absence of a role. The entire apparatus we now take for granted, auditors, ratings agencies, regulators, financial journalism, short sellers, exists to create somebody whose interest lies in the story being false. In 1822, that person did not exist, and Poyais is what the gap looked like. So, what should we take from Poyais? 6 things. First, the mechanism, which is the reason this case is unique. Every other fraud in this series sold a false claim about a real thing: Enron's earnings, Overend's solvency, Hudson's dividends, The gold ring's cornered market. McGregor sold a false thing entire. And the striking discovery is that a wholly invented object is not harder to sell than a partly false one. In some ways it is easier, because there is no inconvenient reality underneath to contradict the story. There were no Poyasian accounts to be caught misstating, no Poyasian harvest to come in short. The fabrication was complete, and completeness gave it internal consistency. Watch for that. An opportunity with no awkward details, no rough edges, no bad quarters, may not be well run. It may be unencumbered by existence. Second, verisimilitude is the weapon, not exaggeration. The sketch of the Mosquito Shore worked because it included the boring parts and admitted the drawbacks. Every subsequent generation of fraud has rediscovered this. The false document that convinces is the one with the errata, the caveats, the modest projections, and the section headed Risks. A story polished to a shine invites suspicion. A story with plausible blemishes invites belief. When you are being sold something, notice whether the drawbacks you are shown are the ones that would actually matter. Third, due diligence checks records, and records can be manufactured. This is the hardest lesson in the episode, and the least comfortable, because it does not resolve into a rule you can follow. The investors and settlers of 1822 did check. The grant was genuine. The general was genuine. The bank was genuine. The office existed, and the book was thorough. Every reachable source returned true, and every one of them had been placed there or repurposed by the same hand. The only check that would have worked was the one nobody could perform: going to look. When the entire evidence base for a decision comes, however indirectly, from a single interested party, you do not have 5 sources. You have one source wearing 5 coats. Fourth, the 2 audience trick, and the false consensus it builds. The bondholders trusted the settlers' commitment. The settlers trusted the bondholders' money. Neither knew both were reading McGregor. If you find yourself reassured that other, quite different people also believe, sophisticated institutions on one side, ordinary families on the other, trace where each group's information actually came from before you count them as independent. Manufactured consensus is the most powerful instrument in this entire catalogue, because it disarms precisely the caution that would otherwise save you. And fifth, the one that should sit uncomfortably, the outcome. 180 people are dead, and the man who caused it received a state funeral and a general's pension in a cathedral. There is no justice in the ending of this story, and this channel is not going to manufacture one. What there is instead is a pattern, the same one traced through the Overend director's acquittal, through Hudson never facing a charge, through the gold ring's untouched conspirators, through the 67 years between the corner and the statute that would have caught it. The law arrives late, always. It is built out of the wreckage of the disaster before last. Poyas is the extreme case, a fraud so far outside anything the law had imagined that no court in 2 countries could work out which offence precisely had been committed. Britain eventually acquired the machinery: prospectus law, company law, securities regulation, the offence of fraudulent misrepresentation with teeth. Every clause of it exists because somebody, once, did something for which there was then no name. And there is a 6th thing, which is less a lesson than a warning about how this story gets told. Poi ice is usually served up as comedy. The shoemaker with his royal appointment, the Poisian dollars, the man who invented a country. It has the shape of a farce, and it is regularly listed among history's most amusing hoaxes. Even the phrase most commonly attached to it, the man who sold a country that didn't exist, invites a smile. Resist that because the comedy is doing something. It relocates the story from the beach to the drawing room, and it quietly makes McGregor the protagonist, the audacious rogue, the magnificent liar, the one whose nerve we are invited to admire. Told that way, the settlers become the joke's punchline, the gullible, the ones who fell for it. They were not gullible. They were people who performed every check available to them in 1822 and were defeated by a man who had manufactured the evidence. They sold real farms for real deeds registered in a real ledger, backed by a genuine royal grant, endorsed by a London banking house, described in a sober book, and validated by a bond trading on the London Stock Exchange. Anyone in this audience dropped into Edinburgh in 1822 with the same information would have had no reliable way to reach a different conclusion. And 180 of them died of it. That is not a farce. It is the largest body count in this channel's entire catalogue of financial disasters, larger than Overend Gurney, larger than the railway Mania, larger than Enron. The South Sea bubble ruined more people. Poyes killed more. So the story is told here as what it is, not a caper, but the extreme demonstration of a permanent condition. That verification has limits, that documents can be built to satisfy every check you know how to make, and that when the checking runs out, what is left is trust. Usually, trust is well placed and the system works. Occasionally, it meets a man like McGregor, and the cost is not measured in money. The comedy is how we make that bearable. It is worth noticing that we do it, and worth declining to. A last footnote on the name. Poyes took its title from the Paya or Poye people of the region, whom the guidebook described as loyal subjects eager to labour for British settlers. They were a real people, with a real territory, who had not been consulted, were not subjects of anyone, and whose land had been described to strangers as a workforce. In a story with a great many victims, they are the ones who appear in no ledger at all. Not investors, not settlers, simply inhabitants of a place that was sold over their heads to people who never arrived in any numbers to trouble them. It is the smallest injustice in the episode, and the only one nobody has ever bothered to count. The Mosquito Coast is still there. The Black River still runs out through mangroves into the Caribbean, and the stretch of shore where 250 people looked for a cathedral is jungle, as it was then and as it had always been. There is no monument. Most of the people who died there have no recorded grave. Somewhere in a British archive there is a bond certificate, correctly engraved, properly sealed, promising 6% on the revenues of the Republic of Poyes, a debt of a country that never existed, issued against the customs receipts of a port that was never built and traded for a while in London by men who had checked. Sources and method. This account draws on the surviving settlers' testimony collected after the 1823 evacuation and the contemporary reporting of the returning ships, the text of the 1822 sketch of the Mosquito Shore published under the name Thomas Strangeways, the prospectus and stock exchange records of the 1822 Poyesian loan, issued through Sir John Perring's house, the record of MacGregor's 1826 trial in France, his Venezuelan service and pension records, and the modern scholarly and biographical literature on the Poyais scheme and on the Latin American loan boom of 1822 to 1825. Where the record is genuinely contested, above all the exact number who sailed and who died, which contemporary sources give with meaningful variation, and how far MacGregor believed his own promotion as against knowingly fabricating it, which his biographers still dispute, this video gives the ranges and the competing readings rather than the most dramatic single figure. The land grant from the Mosquito King is treated as authentic because the documentary evidence supports it. It is the description of that land, not the title to it, that constituted the fraud. On the afternoon of the 10th of May, 1866, at 3:30, a firm most people today have never heard of pinned a notice to its door at the corner of Lombard Street and Birchin Lane in the City of London. The notice said the firm was unable to meet its obligations and had suspended payment. By the next morning, England was in the grip of the most complete financial panic in its history. Crowds filled Lombard Street from end to end, pressing against the doors of every bank in the street, demanding their money in gold. The Times compared the scene to an earthquake. The Bank of England lent out more in a single day than it had ever done in its existence. The government tore up the law governing the currency, for only the third time ever, before the day was out. The firm was Overend, Gurney and Company. It owed roughly £5 million, in today's money comfortably over £500 million, and it was not a bank that ordinary people kept their savings in. It was something more important. It was the bank the banks used, the firm standing at the center of the wholesale money market, where the institutions that held the public's savings placed their own. When an ordinary bank fails, its depositors suffer. When the bank's bank fails, every depositor of every bank has reason to wonder, on the same morning, whether their own institution's money was inside. And that is not a failure. That is a detonation. And here is the fact that gives this story its shape. The Panic of 1866 was the last true run on the English banking system for 141 years. From Black Friday until the queues formed outside Northern Rock in 2007, no English bank suffered a full-scale public run. An entire system was rebuilt around the lessons of this one collapse. And the most important lesson was drawn from the moment the Bank of England looked at the most trusted name in British finance and refused to save it. This is the story of Overend and Gurney, what the firm actually did, which almost nobody understands anymore. How the most respected house in the city became secretly insolvent while its reputation stood untouched. How it sold that hollow reputation to the public 18 months before the end, and how its death created modern central banking. Start with what the firm was, because its business, bill discounting, is extinct as a household concept, and without it, nothing in this story makes sense. Victorian world trade ran on paper called bills of exchange. A bill was, at its simplest, an IOU with a date on it. A merchant in Manchester ships cotton goods to a buyer in Calcutta. The buyer will pay in 3 months when the goods arrive and sell. The buyer, or his bank, signs a bill promising payment of, say, £1,000 on a date 3 months out. Now the Manchester merchant holds a promise of £1,000, but he needs cash today to pay his weavers and buy more cotton. So he sells the bill. A discount house buys it from him for slightly less than its face value, £990, say, and collects the full 1,000 when the bill falls due. That gap, the discount, is the price of turning tomorrow's money into today's. That is the whole mechanism, and it is worth stating a second way because everything turns on it. A discount house is a machine that buys time. It stands between every merchant who needs cash now and every payment that arrives later, and it earns a sliver on each transaction. Multiply that sliver by the trade of the largest commercial empire on Earth, and you have one of the great money machines of the age. Overend, Gurney and Company was that machine's largest example, by a distance. At its height, it discounted more bills than its 3 largest competitors combined. Its turnover in bills across a year was counted in the hundreds of millions of pounds at a time when the entire annual budget of the British state was around 70 million. Country banks across England sent their spare money to Overends to be put to work. London banks kept balances there. The firm was known simply as the Corner House, and in the money market its name meant what the Bank of England's meant to the public. And the name rested on something quite specific. The firm was Quaker. The Gurneys of Norwich were one of the great Quaker banking dynasties, the family that also produced Elizabeth Fry, the prison reformer whose face was, until recently, on the £5 note. Quaker houses dominated early English banking. Barclays, Lloyds, and Gurneys all grew from the same soil, and not by accident. Quakers could not swear oaths, could not attend the universities, could not enter Parliament or the professions. Commerce was what remained, and their communities enforced a commercial discipline the law did not. Plain dealing, plain accounts, debts honoured to the day. A Quaker who failed in business faced his own meeting house. The result, over generations, was that Quaker paper traded on trust that ordinary paper could not command. That trust was the firm's true capital. Hold on to that phrase, because this is a story about what happens when a firm begins, quietly, to spend it. For half a century, the machine ran superbly. Under Samuel Gurney, the banker's banker, the house came through the panic of 1825 with its reputation enhanced, lending support to others while weaker firms failed. This detail matters. Overends had been the rescuer once, the firm that steadied the market in a storm. That memory was still current in 1866, and it is part of why what happened was unthinkable until the afternoon it happened. Then, in the 1850s, the generation that built the machine left it. Samuel Gurney died in 1856. The partners who inherited were younger men, some able, some decidedly not, and they made the oldest mistake in finance, which deserves to be stated carefully because it has killed banks in every century since. The discount business was safe because it was short. A bill ran for 3 months, the firm's own borrowings, money placed with it by banks and investors, repayable at call, meaning on demand, were even shorter. Money in, money out, constantly turning, nothing locked away. If depositors wanted their funds, the bills maturing every single day supplied them. The new partners looked at this beautiful, liquid, low-margin machine and found it dull. The margins on good bills were thin. Elsewhere, fortunes were being made in ships, railways, and grand ventures. So, Overends began to lend differently. Long-term advances against shipping fleets, railway contractors, ironworks, Irish land, grain ventures, a shipyard at Millwall. Assets that could not be sold quickly, funded by money repayable on demand. Borrowed short, lent long. Say it twice, because it is the mechanism of almost every banking collapse in history, this channel's stories included. The firm's promises to pay were instant, and the things it owned were slow. Such a firm is safe on every day except the one day everyone asks at once, and on that day, it is not merely embarrassed. It is dead. Worse, the new ventures were bad, even on their own terms. The partners were bill men, not ship owners or railway financiers. They backed promoters they did not understand, threw good money after bad to conceal early losses, and by the early 1860s, the damage was catastrophic and entirely invisible. The best modern accounting of the book suggests that by around 1861, the firm's bad and doubtful assets had swallowed its capital several times over. The greatest name in the money market was, behind its Quaker plainness, insolvent, and had been for years, while the market went on treating its paper as the next thing to gold. Which brings us to the act that turned a private failure into a public one, and it is the part of this story that still has the power to shock. In the summer of 1865, the partners converted Overend, Gurney and Company into a limited liability company and sold its shares to the public. Understand what this was. The partners knew the hole existed. They had lived with it for years. The public did not. The prospectus inviting subscription mentioned in general terms that certain of the firm's engagements were being separated from the new company, but it disclosed nothing resembling the truth, that the old firm's losses exceeded its capital, and that the goodwill the public was buying was attached to a corpse. On the strength of the name, the corner house, the Quaker house, the house that had steadied the panic of 1825, the offering was oversubscribed. The shares went to a premium. The name was the last asset the firm possessed, and the partners sold it. And there was a trap inside the shares themselves, which Victorian investors understood in principle and disregarded in practice. The shares were £50 shares with only £15 paid up. The remaining £35 was uncalled, meaning that if the company ever failed, the liquidator could come to every shareholder and demand a further £35 per share in cash by law. Buyers of a safe blue-chip share had, without quite feeling it, signed a contingent debt more than twice the size of their investment. If you have watched our Lloyd's episode, you know this shape, the signature that feels like an asset and is actually a liability, priced at zero because the calm years have gone on so long. 18 months of the new company's life were spent as the old firm's had been, losses quietly compounding under a trusted name. Then 1866 arrived, and the environment turned hostile. To understand why 1866 was the year the wave broke, you need to see the sea it broke out of, because Overends was not an isolated bad firm in a sound market. It was the largest instance of a mania. The first half of the 1860s saw a boom in exactly the kind of paper finance the corner house had drifted into. A change in company law, the arrival of general limited liability in 1855 and 1862, had made it suddenly easy to float companies, and the city responded with a rush of new finance companies, ventures whose business was not making or trading anything, but lending to promoters, contracting railways, and holding each other's paper. Dozens were floated in a few years. Their shares boomed. Their assets were loans to men building speculative railways in Wales, Ireland, India, and South America, secured on the hope that traffic would one day appear. At the center of this stood the railway contractors, and their system deserves a moment because it is one of the strangest credit machines Britain ever built. A promoter would launch a railway with almost no subscribed capital. A great contractor, Peto and Betts, or Thomas Brassey, men who commanded armies of navvies larger than most European standing armies, would agree to build the line, taking payment not in cash, but in the railway's own shares and bonds. The contractor then carried this paper to a finance company or a discount house, borrowed against it, and used the cash to pay wages and buy iron. The railway was, in effect, built on bills, layer upon layer of promises, each resting on the eventual profitability of a line that did not yet exist. So long as the paper could be renewed, the machine ran, and navvies were paid, and ironmasters prospered, and everyone held everyone else's IOUs. The moment renewal was refused anywhere in the chain, the whole structure had to find cash that none of it possessed. If this reminds you of the LMX spiral in our Lloyd's episode, risk passed in a circle until nobody could see where it rested, it should. Markets rediscover this architecture roughly once a generation, always with the conviction that this time it is diversification. Overends sat inside this machine twice over, as a lender to contractors and finance companies through its speculative advances, and as the greatest holder and endorser of the bill market's paper generally. When contractor paper began to smell, both of its bodies were exposed. It is also worth pausing on what money at call meant in practice, because the phrase is bloodless, and the reality was not. Every morning, the banks of London and the country banks of England reviewed their positions. Spare cash, money a bank might need tomorrow but not today, was placed with the discount houses at interest, repayable on demand. It was considered the next safest thing to gold in the vault, precisely because you could always have it back by the afternoon. Now run the machine forward from the other side. A country bank in Norfolk grows nervous about the market, about a rumour, about nothing in particular, and calls in £50,000 from Overends simply to be safe. On a normal day, maturing bills cover it without a thought, but Overend's money was no longer all in 3-month bills. Millions of it were in a shipyard at Millwall, in Irish estates, in half-built railways, assets that could not be turned into cash in an afternoon at any price. So the firm paid the Norfolk Bank with the cash meant for tomorrow's callers. Every nervous caller made the next caller's position worse, and, this is the vicious heart of a run, made the next caller more right to call. In a run, prudence and panic give identical instructions. There is no way from outside to tell a bank suffering a temporary shortage from a bank that is already dead, and so the rational response to doubt is always to ask for your money, which converts doubt into fact. That is the second time this video has explained the short-long mechanism, and it will not apologize for it. It is the single most important idea in the history of banking failure, and every collapse this channel has covered or ever will cover contains it somewhere. One more piece of context, and then the trigger. The Bank of England in 1866 did not yet accept that it owed the market rescue in a crisis. Its governors ran it, in law and largely in spirit, as a private company with shareholders whose first duty was its own reserve. The idea that it was the system's guardian, obvious to us, was precisely what had not yet been established. Worse, there was history. 5 years earlier, in a squabble over market practice, Overends had orchestrated a spiteful demonstration against the bank, withdrawing a mass of money in a single stroke to show the old lady how much power the corner house held. The bank had not forgotten. Nobody suggests the refusal of 1866 was revenge. The books were reason enough. But when the directors of Overend Gurney walked into Threadneedle Street that morning, they were not walking into a friendship. Money was tightening across the market. The railway booms, contractor financiers, firms that built lines in exchange for paper, were failing one after another. The gigantic contracting house of Peto and Betts, builder of railways on 4 continents, was visibly staggering. In January, a company with the fatal misfortune to be called Watson, Overend and Company failed. No relation whatever, but the name rattled through the market and depositors did not always pause over the distinction. Through the spring, the money market's nerves wound tighter. This is worth registering as a pattern before we reach the trigger. The proximate cause of a collapse is almost never the real cause. The real cause had been on the books for 5 years. What the spring of 1866 supplied was merely the occasion, the moment when a market already primed to doubt found something specific to doubt about. The trigger, when it came, was almost absurdly technical. In early May, a court ruling in a case involving bills of a small Welsh railway cast doubt on whether certain classes of railway paper were enforceable at all. Holders of contractor bills everywhere suddenly wondered what their paper was worth. Rumour, never far from Overend's by now, fastened on the corner house. The withdrawals began, quiet at first, then not. On the morning of the 10th of May, the directors of Overend Gurney went to the Bank of England and asked to be saved. The bank sent examiners to look at the books. What they found in a few hours was what 18 months of shareholders and 50 years of the market had not seen. The firm was not suffering a temporary shortage of cash against good assets. It was insolvent, its assets were bad, hopelessly and irrecoverably, and no loan could change that. A loan merely delays a funeral. It cannot reverse one. The bank refused. There was no appeal, and there was nowhere else to go. The corner house had spent 50 years being the place others went in extremity, and above it stood only the institution that had just said no. At 3:30, the notice went up on the door. What happened the next day gave Black Friday its name. The panic was not about Overends any longer. Everyone with money anywhere now asked the only question that matters in a run. If that house can fail, what is safe? Crowds besieged the banks of Lombard Street, demanding gold. Perfectly solvent banks watched their reserves drain by the hour, because in a panic solvency is invisible and only cash speaks. The Bank of England lent £4 million in a single day against good security, more than it had ever advanced in a day, and by evening its own reserve was approaching exhaustion. The Chancellor, Gladstone, authorised the suspension of the Bank Charter Act, freeing the bank to issue notes beyond its legal limit. It was only the third suspension in the Act's history, and the letter authorizing it was the government publicly declaring the state stands behind the system, whatever the statute says. Bank rate went to 10%, crisis level, and stayed there for 3 months. And the failure rippled outward for the rest of the year. The great contractor, Peto and Betts, went down within weeks, ending the career of Sir Samuel Peto, the man who had built the Reform Club and railways across the world. Banks in London and the country followed. In total, something like 200 companies failed in the aftermath. The share prices of everything connected to railways and credit were wrecked. Contemporary accounts record ruin spreading through households that had never heard of a bill of exchange, and, in the grimmest entries of that summer, more than one suicide among the ruined. We note it and leave it there. Pause on the night between the refusal and the panic, because contemporaries left a record of it and it deserves its place. The suspension notice went up at 3:30. The evening papers carried it by 6, and that night, by every account, nobody in financial England slept properly. Country bankers took the late trains to London to stand in person at the doors of the houses holding their money. Partners sat up over their books, calculating whether they could survive a day of maximum withdrawals. The Telegraph, still newish, carried the news to Manchester, Liverpool and Glasgow before midnight, so that the provinces woke already frightened. A panic before the Telegraph spread at the speed of the mail coach, giving the system days to brace. This one arrived everywhere at once. Black Friday was, among other things, one of the first financial panics to move at the speed of electricity, a small preview of a world this channel has visited in 2008, where the run happens on screens in minutes, and the queues, when they form at all, form last. Then came the part that the shareholders of Overend Gurney will forever own: the calls. The company's creditors, the banks and depositors it owed £5 million, were in the end paid in full. It took years of liquidation, but the estate covered them. The people destroyed were the shareholders, and they were destroyed twice. First, their £15 a share went to nothing. Then the liquidators exercised the uncalled liability and demanded the remaining £35 per share in cash from every holder: widows, clergymen, tradesmen, trustees for children, people who had bought the safest name in England and now received legal demands for more than double their original stake to pay the debts of a firm that had been broken before they ever bought in. And look at who they were, because the share register of a safe company is a portrait of a society's savers. The registers and the court papers show clergymen and their widows, retired officers on half pay, solicitors holding shares as trustees for orphans and marriage settlements, shopkeepers and farmers who had put a legacy somewhere respectable, and a long tail of small holders in provincial towns who had likely never set foot in Lombard Street. These were precisely the people who buy the trusted name, because they know they cannot judge the books. That is what the name is for. The mechanism of their ruin was that the name had outlived the thing it named. Some 3,000 shareholders were caught. For many, the calls consumed savings, houses, inheritances. The Quaker name they had trusted was the instrument of their ruin, sold to them at a premium when its owners knew, or were in the best position in England to know, what stood behind it. which raises the question Victorian England asked at full volume. Was it a crime? In 1869, after a private prosecution, 6 directors of Overend, Gurney stood trial at the Old Bailey for issuing a fraudulent prospectus. The trial was a sensation. The defense did not deny the losses, or the whole, or the silence of the prospectus. It argued that the directors had honestly believed the new company, carried by the firm's earning power and name, could trade its way out, that this was misjudgment, even grave misjudgment, but not deceit. The jury deliberated by the standards of such trials briefly. It acquitted them, every one. The courtroom, packed with ruined shareholders, is recorded as receiving the verdict in silence, which contemporaries found more eloquent than any protest. The presiding judge himself had distinguished between grave error and criminal fraud, and error is not indictable. The public was furious. The law was, on its own terms, probably right, and the verdict set a precedent that has echoed through every financial collapse since, our Enron episode included. The distance between catastrophic concealment and provable criminal intent is where most financial wrongdoing lives, and it is very hard for a prosecution to cross. One director, it should be said, paid in other coin. Members of the Gurney family poured personal fortunes into the wreck, and the family's banking eminence ended with the firm. One more thread deserves closing. What became of the Quaker world that had built the firm? The Norwich Bank of Gurneys, the sober, original, deposit-taking family bank, a separate business from the London Bill House, survived the storm, though it took a run of its own in the panic week, and stood it. A generation later, it merged with other Quaker houses into Barclays, where the bloodline of that tradition still nominally runs. But the moral economy that had made Quaker a synonym for safe did not survive as a working force in the city. The meeting house discipline had been built for partnerships, where a man's whole fortune stood behind his word, limited liability, the very innovation that let Overend sell itself to the public, dissolved the personal stake that had given the discipline its teeth. The 1866 collapse did not just kill a firm, it marked, as neatly as any single event can, the moment English finance passed from reputations personally underwritten to institutions publicly regulated. Because the first system's flagship had just demonstrated at national cost what happened when the person was gone, and only the reputation remained. Now to the reason this story matters beyond its own wreckage, because out of Black Friday came a doctrine, and the doctrine built the financial world you live in. The Bank of England's conduct in May 1866 had been, in effect, a two-part decision. To Overend Gurney itself, no, because it was insolvent, and lending to the dead merely transfers the loss to the lender. To everyone else, the next day, yes, freely, millions advanced against good security to any solvent house that needed cash to survive the panic. 7 years later, the economist and editor Walter Bargerhot took that episode and made it the center of his book, Lombard Street, still the most influential book ever written about central banking. Barghot's rule, distilled from 1866, runs, in a panic, the central bank must lend freely at a penalty rate against good collateral. Freely, because in a run, hesitation is fuel, at a penalty rate, so only the truly needy come. Against good collateral, because that is the filter separating the illiquid, who deserve rescue from the insolvent who must be allowed to die. The lender of last resort was born as an idea on Black Friday, in the gap between the firm the bank refused and the market it saved. The crisis also killed the world it had grown in ways worth recording. The finance company Mania ended overnight. Most of the new ventures were dead within the year. The discount trade itself never recovered its old primacy. The great joint stock banks, which had watched the corner house's fate closely, increasingly kept their own reserves and did their own discounting. And the bill brokers dwindled across the following decades into a specialist corner of the market. And the swaggering contractor system of railway finance was buried with Pato. British railway building was never again funded on that architecture. A whole ecology of Victorian credit, brilliant, reckless, and interlocking, went into the ground with one firm, which is the surest measure of how central that firm had been. And the doctrine worked spectacularly. The proof came in 1890, and the contrast with 1866 is the whole lesson in 2 acts, so it is worth a moment. Barings Brothers, a house older and grander even than Overend's had been, found itself in that year on the edge of failure, buried in Argentine bonds it could not sell. Same ingredients, a great name, illiquid assets, obligations falling due. But this time the assets were judged fundamentally sound. Argentina would recover. The bonds had value. The problem was time, not truth. So, the Bank of England did what Bagehot had by then taught it to do, and something more. It organized quietly over a single weekend a guarantee fund, the bank itself, the government at its back, and the great banks of London each subscribing, that stood behind Barings' obligations before the public ever learned the danger existed. There was no run, because there was nothing to run from. The announcement of the rescue and the announcement of the crisis were the same announcement. Barings was wound down, reconstructed, and continued for another century. Set the two beside each other, and you have the whole doctrine in practice. Overend's 1866, insolvent, refused, allowed to fail, and the system defended around the corpse. Barings, 1890, illiquid but sound, rescued before breakfast, and the public never queued at all. The distinction between the two firms was exactly the distinction Bagehot drew. Not size, not age, not the grandeur of the name, but whether the assets were real. Every central banker since has been trying to make that same judgment at speed with imperfect books, knowing that either mistake, rescuing the dead, refusing the living, compounds into something worse. And from 1866, as we said at the start, no English bank suffered a full public run for 141 years until Northern Rock in 2007, when a bank that had borrowed short in the money markets to lend long against houses met a week when the short money stopped. The mechanism was Overend Gurneys to the letter. The queues formed because the lender of last resort machinery, after 14 decades of quiet success, hesitated in public. The oldest lesson had to be relearned on television. So, what should we take from the corner house? 5 things. First, a word about the strange near-total forgetting of this event, because it is instructive in itself. The panic of 1866 was, for the people who lived it, the financial catastrophe of the century, bigger in its day than 1825 or 1847. the reference point against which Victorians measured all money troubles. Yet it has almost no place in popular memory now, while smaller American panics live on in books and films. Part of the reason is precisely that its lesson was learned so well. A disaster that successfully prevents its own sequels erases its own memorial. Nobody commemorates the fires that didn't happen. The queues outside Northern Rock in 2007 were, among other things, a nation discovering that it had once known something and forgotten it. Most of the coverage that week reached for 1866 within days, because it was the only precedent England had. Second, and now the mechanism, stated once more because it is the whole story. Borrowing short to lend long is the posture in which every bank dies. It is also inescapably what banking is. The trade cannot exist without the mismatch. Which is why banking is never finally safe, only managed, and why the difference between a banking system and a catastrophe is not cleverness but liquidity, discipline, and a credible last resort. Overends abandoned the first and existed before the second. Third, reputation is capital, and it can be spent by people who did not earn it. The Quaker name was built by 3 generations of plain dealing, and it died in 1 generation of quiet concealment, its final act being its own sale at a premium to the public. That is the same dark trick at the center of our Lloyd's story, Lloyd's always paid, and our Enron story, the number detached from the business. The trust is real, the earning of it was real, and precisely because it is real, it can be borrowed against secretly until the moment it is gone. The more impeccable the name, the longer the concealment can run, and the worse the reckoning. Fourth, the acquittal. The directors ruined 3,000 shareholders with a prospectus that hid an existing insolvency, and the law found no crime because the line between lethal optimism and deceit runs through the interior of other men's minds, where juries cannot follow. Every era rediscovers this at its own expense. The practical lesson is not that the law is broken, it is that the law cannot protect you here, and diligence must do what verdicts cannot. When you are invited to buy a name, ask what stands behind it today, not what stood behind it in its founder's time. And fifth, the refusal. The Bank of England let the most trusted firm in England die, and it was right. Saving Overends would have taught the market that no recklessness forfeits rescue, and the next collapse would have been built on that lesson, larger. The refusal was also, in the short run, catastrophic. Black Friday happened because of it. Both things are true at once, and they define the permanent dilemma of every central bank since. The rescue that prevents this panic finances the next one. Bagehot's rule is the best answer anyone has found. Save the solvent, let the insolvent go, and be seen to know the difference. It was written in the ashes of the corner house, and a century and a half later, in 2008, every central bank on earth was still governing by it, and still arguing about where the line falls. And spare a final thought for the meaning of the queues themselves. The people outside the banks on Black Friday were not speculators. They were depositors behaving rationally in a system whose safety they could not verify. Everything modern banking has built since, the lender of last resort and much later deposit insurance, exists to change that one calculation. to make standing in the queue unnecessary by making the promise behind the counter credible without inspection. When the machinery works, it is invisible, and generations forget why it exists. It worked invisibly for 141 years. That silence was Overend Gurney's true monument. The corner of Lombard Street and Birchin Lane is still there. The firm that made it famous is remembered, when it is remembered at all, as a footnote to a doctrine. But for one afternoon in May 1866, it stood at the center of the financial world in the worst way a firm can, as the proof, pinned to its own door, that no name is a substitute for the truth about what stands behind it. Sources and method. This account draws on the contemporary record of the suspension and Black Friday in the Times and the Economist of May 1866, the Banker's Magazine accounts of the liquidation and the shareholder calls, the report of the 1869 Old Bailey trial of the directors, Walter Bagehot's Lombard Street of 1873, the correspondence surrounding the suspension of the Bank Charter Act, and the modern scholarly literature on the crisis, including the accounting reconstructions of the firm's insolvency and the economic histories of the 1866 panic and its place in the development of the lender of last resort doctrine. Where the record is genuinely contested, above all what the directors believed at the time of the 1865 flotation, on which their acquittal turned, and how far the Bank of England's refusal was principle rather than an assessment it was only able to make in hindsight. This video presents the competing readings rather than the most damning one. Figures for the firm's liabilities, the day's advances, and the wave of consequent failures are given as contemporaries, and later historians record them, rounded rather than falsely precise.
In December 1973, the Governor of the Bank of England called the chairman of the major clearing banks to a meeting and told them that the British banking system was days away from collapsing. Not a bank, the system. The institutions in trouble were not the ones anyone was watching. They were not Barclays or Midland or Lloyds. They were companies with names most people had never heard. London and County Securities, Cedar Holdings, Triumph Investment Trust. And the reason nobody was watching them is the whole point of this story. They were not banks. Legally, technically, formally, they were not banks at all. They took money from the public and lent it out at interest, which is what a bank does, but they had been incorporated under a different section of a different act. And so they fell outside the Bank of England's supervision entirely. Nobody had decided that. It was not a policy. It was a gap, and it had been sitting there for years while a whole parallel banking system grew inside it. This is the story of the secondary banking crisis, the largest British financial rescue between the war and 2008, run almost entirely in secret, and now so thoroughly forgotten that most people working in the city today have never heard of it. Start with what a secondary bank actually was, because the category is unfamiliar now. In the 1960s, British banking was dominated by a small number of clearing banks, the ones with branches on every high street. They were conservative, cartelized, and heavily constrained. The Bank of England did not supervise them through formal rules so much as through what was known as the governor's eyebrows, informal pressure, private conversations, and an understanding of what was and was not done. That system worked after a fashion because the number of institutions was small and they all knew each other. Alongside them, a second tier, had grown up. These were finance houses, hire purchase companies, property lenders, and investment trusts. Some had been operating for decades in specialist niches. Others were new. What they had in common was that they took deposits from companies, from local authorities, from wealthy individuals, and increasingly from the wholesale money markets, and lent that money out, which is banking. But they held their banking status, if any, under Section 12(3) of the Companies Act 1967, a provision that allowed the Board of Trade to certify a company as carrying on a banking business for certain purposes. It was a technical designation obtained largely for tax and commercial reasons. It did not bring them within the Bank of England's supervisory arrangements. The bank supervised institutions on the list it maintained under the Exchange Control Act. The authorized banks and the secondary institutions were not on it. So you had a growing number of companies performing the economic function of banks, describing themselves as banks, being treated by the public as banks, and being supervised by nobody. Now the fuel, because the gap alone would not have produced a crisis. Two things happened at the start of the 1970s that turned a structural weakness into a disaster. The first was competition and credit control, introduced by the Bank of England in 1971. It was a genuine and largely well-intentioned reform. The old system of direct lending ceilings and the clearing bank interest rate cartel had become distorting. It restricted competition and it pushed lending outside the regulated sector precisely because the regulated sector was capped. So the bank dismantled it. Lending ceilings went. The cartel went. Banks were to compete freely, with monetary policy operating through interest rates and reserve requirements rather than direct instruction. The intention was to bring lending back into the visible, supervised system. The immediate effect was an explosion of credit. Bank lending to the private sector rose enormously in the following 2 years, by some measures more than doubling. Money supply growth ran at rates that would now be considered alarming. The second thing was the property boom, and the two are inseparable. Commercial property prices in Britain rose extraordinarily in the early 1970s. Office values in London roughly tripled over a few years. Development sites changed hands repeatedly at rising prices, and each transaction validated the next. For a lender, property is attractive collateral. It is tangible, it is valued by professionals, and in a rising market, the loan-to-value ratio improves every month without anybody doing anything. The secondary banks lent into that boom very heavily indeed. It was their principal business, and their principal appeal to depositors was the interest rate they could pay, which they could afford precisely because property lending was so profitable while values rose. Now the structural problem inside those institutions, which is the mechanism that actually killed them. A property development loan is long. A building takes years to design, obtain permission for, construct, and let. The lender's money is committed for the duration. The money funding those loans was short. Secondary banks raised much of their funding on the wholesale money markets, deposits placed for weeks or months by companies, local authorities, and other financial institutions seeking a return on cash. So the balance sheet was fundamentally mismatched: long, illiquid assets funded by short, mobile liabilities. That is the same structure as an ordinary bank, which also borrows short and lends long. The difference is that an ordinary bank has a branch network of retail depositors who are sticky, holds reserves, and crucially has access to the central bank as lender of last resort. The secondary banks had none of those things. Their depositors were professional, unsentimental, and could move money elsewhere with a phone call. They held minimal reserves. And because they were not on the Bank of England's list, they had no lender of last resort at all. That combination is only stable while confidence holds. The moment the wholesale market declines to roll over a deposit, there is no mechanism for survival. Then 1973 happened. Then tilling. Interest rates rose sharply as the bank tried to control the credit expansion it had unleashed. Minimum lending rate reached 13% in November, an extraordinary level at the time. Rising rates do two things to a property lender simultaneously, and both are fatal. They increase the cost of the short-term funding immediately because those deposits reprice every few weeks. And they reduce the value of the property because a building is worth the income it produces discounted at prevailing rates, so when rates rise, values fall. Costs up, collateral down at the same moment. Then in October, the Yom Kippur War produced the oil embargo. Oil prices quadrupled and Britain entered a period of severe economic disruption. In December, the government imposed the 3-day week to conserve electricity during the miners' dispute. Into that environment, on the 20th of November 1973, London and County Securities, a secondary bank with a high profile and political connections, announced results that revealed serious problems, and its share price collapsed. The wholesale market did what wholesale markets do. It stopped lending to anything that looked like London and County. That is the moment the crisis began, and it moved with remarkable speed. Deposits were withdrawn from secondary banks across the sector, not because each institution had been individually assessed and found wanting, but because nobody could tell which ones were sound, and the cost of finding out exceeded the cost of simply withdrawing. That is a run. It has the same logic as a queue outside a branch, conducted between institutions by telephone, invisible to the public. Within weeks, a substantial part of the secondary banking sector was insolvent or heading there. Now the response, which is the genuinely interesting part. The Bank of England had a problem with no good options. It could let them fail. That was the technically correct answer. These institutions were not authorized banks. They had taken risks knowingly, and there was a strong argument that rescuing them would reward recklessness and create an expectation of rescue for the future. But the bank rapidly concluded that letting them fail would not stay contained. The reasons are worth setting out because they are the standard argument for intervention, and this is one of the clearest cases of it. First, the secondary banks owed money to the clearing banks. The clearers had lent to them, taken their paper, and in some cases owned stakes in them. A cascade of secondary failures would land on the primary system. Second, the depositors were not only professionals. Members of the public had money with these institutions, believing them to be banks because they were called banks. Third, and most importantly, a wave of forced liquidations would have dumped an enormous quantity of commercial property onto a falling market simultaneously. That would have driven values down further, which would have impaired the property loans held by the clearing banks as well, turning a secondary crisis into a primary one through the collateral channel. So on the 19th of December 1973, the governor, Gordon Richardson, convened the clearing banks at the Bank of England and put a proposal to them. The clearers, together with the Bank of England, would provide recycled deposits to the secondary banks, replacing the wholesale funding that had disappeared, to allow them to remain liquid while their property assets were sold in an orderly way over time rather than dumped at once. This became known as the lifeboat. The details matter. The bank contributed around 10% of the support and the clearing banks. The remaining 90%, which was a deliberate design, the bank did not want to be seen to be underwriting institutions it had never supervised, and it wanted the clearers to have their own money at risk so that they would insist on discipline. At its peak, the lifeboat had extended something over £1 billion of support, an enormous figure for 1974, comparable in relative terms to interventions that would later be discussed in trillions. More than 20 institutions were supported. Some were wound down, some were sold, a few survived in altered form. And it was done, as far as possible, quietly. That is the aspect of this episode that is most striking now and most alien. There was no announcement, no press conference, no statement to Parliament at the time, no televised address. The rescue was arranged in private meetings between the governor and the clearing bank chairman, and the participants agreed not to discuss it. The reasoning was straightforward and, in its own terms, sound. The entire problem was a loss of confidence, and publicizing a rescue would confirm the thing depositors were frightened of. Secrecy was not a cover-up in the sense of hiding wrongdoing. It was regarded as the operative mechanism of the rescue itself. Whether that could be done today is doubtful, and it is worth asking why. It required a small number of institutions, a governor with enough authority to summon them, a press with less capacity to investigate financial arrangements, and a culture in which a private undertaking between gentlemen was regarded as binding. Every one of those conditions has weakened. The 2007 run on Northern Rock, queues in the street, filmed, is what happens when the same problem occurs in a world where it cannot be kept quiet. Now the cost and the outcome, because it is often described as a success, and that requires examination. In narrow terms, it worked. There was no collapse of the clearing banking system. The property assets were disposed of over several years rather than in a fire sale. Most of the lifeboat support was eventually repaid. The Bank of England's own losses were relatively modest, and the clearing banks absorbed losses they could sustain. Depositors in the supported institutions were largely protected. But the wider picture is less flattering. Property values fell by something in the order of half from their peak. The stock market fell catastrophically. The FT30 lost around 70% of its value between 1972 and the trough at the start of 1975, which remains one of the worst declines in British market history. Slater Walker, one of the emblematic conglomerates of the era, required its own separate support arrangement from the Bank of England in 1975. And the underlying economic conditions, inflation reaching over 20%, the oil shock, industrial disruption, continued and worsened, culminating in the IMF loan of 1976. So the lifeboat prevented a banking collapse inside an economic disaster. It did not prevent the disaster. Which brings us to the reforms, because this is where the lasting consequence lies. The crisis made the supervisory gap impossible to ignore. An entire category of institution had been performing banking functions with no oversight, and when it failed, the state had been obliged to organize a rescue anyway. That is the worst of all arrangements. The institutions had the freedom of being unsupervised and, in practice, the protection of being systemic. The Banking Act 1979 was the direct response. It established, for the first time in British history, a statutory system of banking supervision. Deposit-taking became a licensed activity requiring authorization from the Bank of England. A two-tier structure was created, distinguishing recognized banks from licensed deposit takers, and both were brought under supervision. It also created the first British Deposit Protection Scheme, funded by contributions from the institutions themselves. Read that list and notice what it implies. Before 1979, Britain had no statutory bank licensing and no deposit insurance. The system had run for centuries on the Bank of England's informal authority over a club of institutions that knew each other. The secondary banking crisis is what happened when that club stopped containing everyone who mattered. Now, the mechanism generalized because it recurs and it is recurring. The pattern is this: a regulated sector is constrained by capital requirements, by lending limits, by supervision. Those constraints impose costs. Activity, therefore, migrates to institutions that perform the same economic function without bearing the same costs, because they fall outside the definition the regulation uses. The migration is not a conspiracy. It is the ordinary consequence of a rule that binds one category of firm and not another performing the same activity. The unregulated sector then grows fastest because it is cheapest, and it is invisible to the authorities precisely because it is defined as being outside their remit. So nobody is measuring it. And when it fails, it turns out to be connected to the regulated sector after all, through lending, through shared collateral, through common depositors. So the authorities intervene anyway. That is the shape of the secondary banking crisis. It is also, in substantial part, the shape of 2008. The institutions at the center of the American crisis were not primarily commercial banks. They were investment banks, structured investment vehicles, conduits, and money market funds, entities performing maturity transformation, borrowing short and lending long, outside the perimeter of banking supervision and without access to the discount window. Northern Rock in Britain was a bank, but its funding model was the same one, a small retail base and heavy reliance on wholesale markets that could and did disappear in days. The specific vehicles change. The structure is identical, bank-like activity, conducted by non-banks, funded short and lent long, invisible to supervision until it is systemic. There is one more element worth drawing out, and it concerns the trigger. The crisis is often described as being caused by the property crash. That is not quite right, and the distinction matters. The property lending was the exposure. The trigger was the withdrawal of wholesale funding, and that withdrawal happened because of a loss of confidence in the sector, not because anyone had calculated that particular property loans were bad. A firm with sound assets and short funding can be destroyed by a funding withdrawal. A firm with poor assets and stable funding can survive for years while it works them out. Which means the vulnerability to watch is not the quality of the assets. It is the stability of the liabilities, how quickly the money funding an institution can leave, and whether anyone is obliged to keep lending when it becomes frightening. That is the question that would have identified every secondary bank in 1972, and it did not require any judgment about property values at all. it is worth spending longer on the individual institutions because the abstractions only mean something when you can see how one of these companies actually operated. London and County Securities is the clearest case, and it is the one that started the run. It had grown very fast. Founded in the 1960s, it expanded through acquisitions into a group doing second mortgage lending, property finance, and general banking-style business. Its chairman, Gerald Kaplan, was a prominent figure, and the board included well-known public names, including, at one point, the leader of the Liberal Party, Jeremy Thorpe. That last detail is worth registering, not as gossip, but as evidence of how respectable these institutions appeared. A company with a party leader on its board is not operating on the fringe of respectable finance, it is at the center of it, at least as the public would perceive it. Its lending included second mortgages at high rates to borrowers who could not obtain finance from a clearing bank, and property loans at the speculative end of the market. Both are profitable, while values rise, and both fail together when they do not. When the results published in November 1973 revealed the position, the share price fell by roughly half in a day, and the wholesale market simply stopped. What happened next is the important part, and it is what makes this a systemic event rather than one company's failure. Depositors did not perform a careful analysis of which other secondary banks resembled London and County. They withdrew from the category. That is rational behavior for an individual depositor and catastrophic in aggregate. If you cannot cheaply distinguish a sound institution from an unsound one, and the cost of being wrong is total loss, the correct individual action is to withdraw from all of them and re-examine later. Which means an institution's fate depended not on its own lending decisions, but on whether it was classified in the same bucket as the first one to fail. Several of the supported institutions were, by most accounts, reasonably run. They failed because their funding was of a kind that leaves when frightened, and they were adjacent to something frightening. Cedar Holdings is the other case worth describing because its rescue came before the general lifeboat and shows how the mechanism developed. Cedar was a second mortgage lender that ran into trouble at the end of 1973. Its principal shareholders included substantial institutions, and a rescue was assembled in a single weekend in December. The shareholders and a group of banks putting up support to prevent an immediate collapse. That weekend is generally regarded as the moment the Bank of England recognized the problem was not going to be contained institution by institution. Within days, the general lifeboat was being organized. Now, the mechanics of the lifeboat itself, because the banks provided support, hides a good deal of structure. The support took the form of recycled deposits. The clearing banks placed money with the secondary institutions, replacing the wholesale deposits that had been withdrawn. That is not a capital injection. It does not absorb losses. It is liquidity provided so that the institution does not have to sell assets immediately. The distinction matters enormously and is frequently muddled. An institution with good assets and no cash needs liquidity, and providing it costs the provider nothing in the end because the loan is repaid. An institution whose assets are worth less than its liabilities needs capital, and providing it means somebody absorbing a loss. The lifeboat was designed as a liquidity operation on the theory that the property assets were fundamentally sound and only unsaleable at that particular moment. For some institutions, that was true. For others, it was not, and the support turned into losses. That ambiguity between illiquid and insolvent is the central difficulty in every rescue of this kind, and it is usually impossible to resolve at the moment the decision has to be made. The distinction only becomes clear later when the assets are eventually sold. Which is why rescues are always criticized. The critics who say the institutions were insolvent and should have been allowed to fail, and the defenders who say they were merely illiquid, are both arguing about a fact that nobody knew at the time. There is a control mechanism worth noting too. The clearing banks providing support insisted on conditions, restrictions on new lending, on dividends, on the disposal of assets, and in some cases installed their own people. Support came with supervision attached, imposed by creditors rather than by a regulator. That is an interesting arrangement, and it is essentially what happens whenever a lender rescues a borrower. It was, in this case, a private substitute for the public supervision that had never existed. Now, the property market itself, in more detail, because the scale of the reversal explains why the assets could not simply be sold. The boom had been extraordinary. Between roughly 1970 and 1973, commercial property values in Britain rose sharply, driven by a combination of easy credit, inflation expectations, and a genuine shortage of modern office space in London. Development finance in that market followed a standard pattern. A developer would borrow to acquire a site, borrow more to build, and repay by either selling the completed building or refinancing it against its rental income. The whole structure depended on the building being lettable and on refinancing being available at the end. When rates rose to 13% and the economy contracted, both assumptions failed at once. Tenants did not appear, refinancing was unavailable. And the value of the completed building, the number the whole loan had been sized against, fell substantially. Some buildings completed in that period stood empty for years. Centre Point in London had already become a public symbol of speculative development, standing vacant, and the politics of empty office blocks during a housing shortage were poisonous. So, the collateral behind the secondary bank's lending was not merely worth less. In many cases, it was genuinely unsaleable at any price the lender could accept, which is precisely the condition under which an orderly disposal over years is the only alternative to writing it off entirely. That is what the lifeboat bought: time, not a solution, time in which to sell things gradually into a market that would eventually recover. It is worth being clear about who ultimately paid, because it was not nobody. The shareholders of the secondary banks were largely wiped out. That is the correct outcome, and it happened. The clearing banks absorbed losses on the support they provided, which fell on their own shareholders and, indirectly, on their customers through pricing. The Bank of England took some losses on its 10% share. Depositors were largely protected, which was the point. And the broader public paid through the economic conditions the crisis contributed to, though disentangling the banking crisis from the oil shock, inflation, and industrial disruption of the same years is genuinely difficult, and anyone claiming a precise figure is guessing. What can be said is that the loss was distributed among parties who had some connection to the risk, rather than falling on depositors who had none. That is a defensible outcome, and it is not automatic. It was the result of a decision. There is a further comparison worth making with the same country 34 years later. Northern Rock in 2007 had a funding model that would have been instantly recognizable to anyone who lived through 1973. A modest retail deposit base and heavy reliance on wholesale markets and securitization to fund long-dated mortgage lending. When the wholesale market closed in August 2007, the mechanism was identical, not a judgment about Northern Rock's mortgage book, which was of reasonable quality. A withdrawal of short funding from an institution that could not survive without it. The differences are instructive. Northern Rock was a bank, fully supervised, with deposit insurance in place, all the things that did not exist in 1973. And it still failed, because the deposit insurance at the time was partial and co-insured, which gave depositors a rational reason to queue. So, the lesson of 1973 had been learned in one respect and not in another. The perimeter had been fixed. The funding vulnerability had not. There is a final observation about why this episode has vanished from memory. Partly, it is the secrecy. An event conducted deliberately, without publicity, leaves fewer traces. There is no footage of a queue, no famous photograph, no single dramatic day. Partly, it is the company it keeps. 1973 to 1976 in Britain contains the oil shock, the three-day week, the miners' strikes, 20% inflation, 2 general elections, and the IMF loan. A banking rescue conducted in private meetings does not compete with that for attention. And partly it is that it worked. Prevented disasters generate no anniversaries. The counterfactual, a cascade of failures through the clearing banks in 1974, did not happen, so there is nothing to commemorate. Which is a general difficulty with successful crisis management, and one worth stating plainly: it produces no evidence of its own necessity. The people who organized the lifeboat were criticized at the time for rescuing the reckless, and the only defense available to them was a description of something that had not occurred. That is a hard argument to win, and it is the reason interventions of this kind are usually late. The last thing worth saying is about what the episode reveals regarding definitions. Everything that went wrong followed from a legal boundary that did not match an economic one. Institutions doing banking were not classified as banks because the classification was drawn by reference to a Companies Act provision rather than to what the institutions actually did. The fix in 1979 was to redraw the boundary around the activity, deposit taking, rather than around a category of company. That is the right principle, and it is a principle that has to be reapplied continuously, because financial innovation consists very largely of finding new containers for old activities. A money market fund is a bank that is not called one. A stablecoin issuer takes deposits and invests them, and is not called a bank either. The question that identified the secondary banks in 1973 is the same one that identifies their successors now, and it is not a technical question at all. Does this institution take money from people who expect to get it back on demand and lend it out for longer than that? If so, it is a bank, whatever the statute says, and it will eventually need somebody to stand behind it, whether or not anybody has agreed to. There is one more question this raises, which is why the reform took 6 years. The crisis was acute in December 1973. The Banking Act did not reach the statute book until 1979. That is a long gap for a problem everyone involved understood immediately, and the reasons are worth examining because they recur. The first is that the immediate emergency was handled. Once the lifeboat was in place and the runs had stopped, the pressure to legislate fell away. Crisis reform is driven by fear, and fear is a depreciating asset. The second is that Britain in those years had other things occupying it. Two general elections in 1974, the oil shock, inflation running above 20%, the IMF negotiation in 1976. Banking supervision legislation is technical, uncontroversial in principle, and therefore easy to postpone in favor of anything with a deadline. The third is that the Bank of England was genuinely ambivalent. Its supervisory tradition was informal, personal, and discretionary, and it valued that. A statutory licensing regime meant rules, appeals, published criteria, and a loss of the flexibility that the eyebrows had provided. There were people at the bank who regarded formal supervision as a downgrade rather than an improvement. And the fourth is that a European Community Directive on credit institutions was in preparation, and there was an argument for waiting to see what it required rather than legislating twice. None of those reasons is disgraceful. Together they produced a 6-year delay in closing a gap that had just cost over £1 billion to paper over. That pattern, acute crisis, emergency response, delayed reform, fading urgency, is close to universal. The useful observation is that the reform window closes fast, and the quality of what gets legislated depends heavily on how much was prepared before the crisis rather than after it. There is also something worth saying about the people who were right in advance. Concerns about the secondary sector had been raised before 1973. The rapid growth in lending after competition and credit control was visible in the monetary statistics, and there were commentators pointing out that a great deal of it was going into property and being funded by short money. The difficulty was that being right early is indistinguishable from being wrong. Anyone who warned in 1972 that the secondary banks were dangerous spent a year watching them post excellent results. That is the structural problem with this class of warning. The vulnerability is in the funding structure, which produces no symptoms at all while confidence holds. There is no gradual deterioration to point at, no rising default rate, nothing that shows up in the results. The institution looks entirely healthy right up until the moment its funding leaves, and then it is finished within weeks. Which means the evidence supporting a warning never improves until it is too late to act on. That is an uncomfortable thing to build a supervisory system around, and it is the reason modern regulation focuses on liquidity coverage and funding stability rather than waiting for asset quality to deteriorate. Those rules exist because of episodes like this one, institutions that were solvent on paper and destroyed by the maturity of their liabilities. One further point about what the clearing banks got out of it. It is tempting to read the lifeboat as public-spirited, and there was an element of that. But the clearers had substantial commercial reasons to participate, and it is worth being honest about them. They were creditors of the secondary banks. They held property lending of their own that would be marked down if a fire sale occurred. Several of them had equity stakes in the institutions being supported, and they operated in a system where the governor's request was not, in practical terms, refusable. So, the lifeboat was not charity. It was a group of creditors acting together to protect their own collateral, coordinated by a central bank, with the authority to convene them and the standing to make participation expected. That is a more durable basis for a rescue than goodwill, and it is why the arrangement held. Everybody in the room had money at stake. which is worth remembering when this kind of coordination is proposed today. It works when the participants are exposed. It does not work when they are not, and no amount of moral pressure substitutes for that. There is a last thread worth pulling about the phrase that gave the sector its name. Secondary bank was not what these institutions called themselves. They called themselves banks. The qualifier was applied afterwards by the authorities and the press once the category needed a name in order to be discussed. That is a small thing, and it is genuinely revealing. A sector that has no name cannot be measured because there is no line in any statistical return corresponding to it. The Bank of England collected data on the institutions it supervised. Nobody was aggregating the balance sheets of the ones it did not, because they were not a category. They were simply a set of companies that happened to be doing similar things. So the answer to how big is the secondary banking sector in 1972 was not a large number. It was that the question could not be asked because the sector did not exist as an object of measurement. Naming a thing is the precondition for counting it, and counting it is the precondition for noticing it has become dangerous. That sequence. Activity migrates outside the perimeter. The migrated activity has no name. Having no name, it has no statistics. Having no statistics, it is invisible until it fails. Is the most durable part of this whole story, and it is the part that is repeated most exactly. Shadow banking is a term from 2007. The activity it describes had been growing for a decade before anybody named it, and the naming is what made it possible to estimate its size, which turned out to be far larger than the people responsible for financial stability had assumed. The parallel is close enough to be uncomfortable. In both cases, the activity was legal, visible in principle, conducted by identifiable companies filing accounts, and collectively invisible because nobody had defined the aggregate, which suggests a practical test that does not require any forecasting skill at all. Ask what proportion of credit in an economy is being extended by institutions that do not appear in the banking statistics. If the answer is not readily available, that is itself the finding. In 1972, nobody could have answered it for Britain. In 2006, nobody could answer it for the United States. Those are not coincidences. They are the same condition, and it is a condition that can be detected without predicting anything. And that, in the end, is what makes this episode worth an hour rather than a footnote. It is not a story about property, or about the 1970s, or about a group of aggressive lenders who overreached. Those are the surface. It is a story about a definitional boundary that stopped matching economic reality, went unnoticed for years because nothing was measuring the gap, and then cost over £1 billion and 6 years of legislation to close. The boundary has been redrawn since, several times. It will need redrawing again because financial activity moves and definitions do not move by themselves. The only real defense is somebody whose job it is to keep asking where the banking is happening now, rather than asking whether the banks are behaving. One closing detail, which has stayed with me more than any of the numbers. The meeting on the 19th of December 1973 lasted a matter of hours. The governor set out the position, the clearing bank chairman agreed to participate, and the arrangement that prevented a systemic collapse was settled between a small number of men in one room on the same day the country was told it would be working 3 days a week. There was no legislation behind it, no statutory power compelled anybody to attend or to contribute. It rested entirely on the authority of an institution and the expectation that a request from it would be honored. That is either reassuring or alarming depending on your temperament, and it is worth holding both readings at once. It was fast, it worked, and it could not be replicated today, because the informality that made it possible is the same informality that had allowed the gap to open in the first place. In 1957, an insurance company in London added a sentence to its contracts. It was not controversial. Nobody objected, nobody priced it, and for the next 35 years, it cost nothing at all. That sentence destroyed the oldest mutual insurer in the world. Not a fraud, not a rogue trader, not a run, not a bubble. No one stole anything. The Equitable Life Assurance Society was killed by a promise it had made in good faith to its own members and then could not keep. And the mechanism that killed it is sitting inside a great many institutions today, invisible for exactly the same reason it was invisible then. This is the story of a guarantee that looked free. Start with what Equitable Life actually was, because it was not an ordinary company, and the difference matters enormously to what happened. It was founded in 1760. That makes it older than the United States, older than the Bank of England's banknote monopoly, older than the Industrial Revolution it would go on to insure. It was the first insurer anywhere to price life assurance using actual mortality tables rather than guesswork. The first to work out, statistically, how long people were likely to live and to charge accordingly. That sounds obvious now. It was revolutionary then. Before Equitable, life insurance was closer to gambling, a flat premium regardless of age, which meant the young subsidized the old and the whole thing collapsed whenever the age mix shifted. Equitable's founders applied mathematics to it, and in doing so, invented the modern actuarial profession. So this was not a fringe operation. This was the institution that taught the industry how to do the arithmetic. And it was a mutual, which is the second thing to understand. A mutual has no shareholders. The policyholders own it. There is no external capital, no share issue to fall back on, no parent company to inject funds. Every pound of surplus belongs to the members, and every pound of loss comes out of the members. That structure was, for 2 centuries, the source of its strength. No shareholders meant no dividends leaking out, no pressure for quarterly results, no conflict between the owners of the company and its customers, because they were the same people. It was also, in the end, the reason there was nobody to catch it when it fell. Now the guarantee itself, which requires understanding a specific piece of pension machinery. If you were saving for retirement through a with-profits pension in the middle of the 20th century, you paid in over your working life, and at the end you converted your accumulated fund into an annuity, an income for life. The rate at which that conversion happened determined your pension. A better annuity rate meant more income from the same pot. Annuity rates move with interest rates and with life expectancy. If rates are high and people die relatively young, an insurer can afford to pay generously. If rates fall and people live longer, the same pot buys much less. What Equitable added in the late 1950s was a guaranteed annuity rate, a floor. Whatever happens to interest rates between now and your retirement, we will convert your fund at no worse than this specified rate. Read that again with the benefit of hindsight, and it should look alarming. It is an open-ended promise about conditions decades in the future, made by an institution with no shareholder capital and given away without an explicit charge. At the time, it looked like nothing. Here is why it looked like nothing, and this is the part that generalizes far beyond one insurer. In the late 1950s and through the 1960s and 1970s and most of the 1980s, market interest rates were comfortably above the guaranteed level. The guarantee was written at rates that seemed conservative. Actual annuity rates available were better, so the floor never bound. Every policyholder retiring took the market rate, because the market rate was higher and the guarantee sat there unused. A promise that never has to be honored has no visible cost. It does not appear as an expense. It generates no cash outflow. In the accounting of the day, it barely appeared at all. And it had a genuine commercial benefit. It was a selling point. It made the product more attractive than a competitor's without apparently costing anything. Other insurers offered similar guarantees for the same reason. Then came the thing nobody planned for, which was not a crash. Inflation fell. Through the 1990s, across the developed world, inflation came down and stayed down, and with it came a long decline in interest rates. That is generally regarded as one of the great economic achievements of the period, and for most purposes, it was. For anyone who had guaranteed an annuity rate in 1957, it was a slow-motion catastrophe. Because, as market rates fell below the guaranteed level, the floor started to bind. Suddenly, the guarantee was not a decoration. It was a live obligation to pay pensions at rates the company could no longer earn. And at the same time, the second variable moved against them too. People were living longer, significantly longer than the tables assumed when the guarantees were written. An annuity is a promise to pay until death. Every additional year of average life expectancy makes every annuity more expensive. So both halves of the calculation deteriorated simultaneously for a reason that was nobody's fault and that no one could reverse. By the late 1990s, Equitable Life had a problem it could not price its way out of. Roughly 90,000 policyholders held guaranteed annuity rates. The cost of honoring them in full ran to well over £1 billion. And there were no shareholders to ask. Which brings us to the decision that turned a financial problem into an existential one. The board's response was ingenious, and it was the beginning of the end. They did not refuse to honor the guarantees. Refusing outright would plainly have been a breach of contract. Instead, they used the one lever A, with Profits Fund gives its directors the terminal bonus. A with Profits policy has two parts. There is the guaranteed sum, which accrues over the years and cannot be taken away. And there is a final or terminal bonus, awarded at the point the policy matures, at the discretion of the directors, reflecting how the underlying investments have performed. That discretion is real and it is necessary. It is what allows a with profits fund to smooth returns across good years and bad. It is not, in itself, a loophole. Equitable used it as one. Policyholders who exercised their guaranteed annuity rate were awarded a smaller terminal bonus than policyholders who took the market rate instead. The logic was that the guarantee and the bonus were two forms of the same thing, a share of the fund, and it was only fair that someone taking a valuable guarantee should take a correspondingly smaller share elsewhere. Otherwise, the argument went, the guaranteed policyholders would be subsidized by everybody else. The effect was that the guarantee, in practice, was worth very little. You could have the rate you had been promised, or you could have your bonus, but not both. Which raises the obvious question, and it is the question that went to court: is a guarantee you are penalized for using a guarantee at all? The case is equitable. Life Assurance Society against Hyman, and it is one of the most consequential pieces of British financial litigation of the last century. Equitable itself brought the action. That is worth pausing on. The society went to court seeking a declaration that its differential bonus policy was lawful. It wanted certainty, and it expected to win. It had legal advice that the director's discretion over terminal bonuses was effectively unfettered. At first instance, it did win. The High Court found for the society. The Court of Appeal reversed that, and in July 2000, the case reached the House of Lords, then the highest court in the land. The Lords were unanimous, and their reasoning is the heart of this story. They accepted that the directors had a broad discretion over terminal bonuses. That was not in dispute. What they held was that the discretion could not lawfully be exercised in a way that defeated the very guarantee the society had given. A power conferred for one purpose cannot be used to nullify a promise made elsewhere in the same contract. Lord Steyne put it in terms of what the reasonable policyholder would have understood. Someone reading their contract would understand the guarantee to be worth something. A discretion exercised specifically to cancel out its value could not be what the parties had agreed. The society lost. The guarantees had to be honored in full, and the terminal bonuses paid alongside them. The bill was around £1.5 billion. Now consider what a mutual with no shareholders does when handed a bill of that size. There is no rights issue because there are no shares, there is no parent company, there is no external capital of any kind. There is only the fund, which belongs to the policyholders, all of them, including the ones with no guarantee at all. So the cost fell on the membership. The people who had to pay for the guarantees were, in large part, people who did not have them. 8 days after the House of Lords ruling, Equitable Life closed to new business. It tried first to sell itself. The sale process failed once the scale of the liability was clear, because a buyer would have been buying the liability. With no new premiums coming in, a closed fund can only shrink. Then came the part that hurt most, and it is the part people still talk about. The society cut policy values. In July 2001, it applied a reduction of 16% to with-profits policy values, a straightforward write-down of what people believed they had saved. It imposed heavy exit penalties on anyone trying to leave. Around 1 million policyholders were affected in one form or another. These were not speculators. They were teachers, doctors, civil servants, and a very large number of self-employed professionals, because Equitable had been particularly strong in the market for individual pensions among the professions. It had a reputation for probity that stretched back 2 centuries, and low charges, which is precisely why careful people chose it. The people most exposed to this were, by and large, the people who had been most prudent. Then the question of who was supposed to have noticed. The government commissioned an inquiry under Lord Penrose, which reported in 2004, and its conclusions were uncomfortable for almost everyone involved. Penrose found that Equitable had been paying out more than it was earning for years, distributing bonuses that its actual investment returns did not support, so that the fund was progressively weakened long before the annuity guarantee crystallized. The society had, in his phrase, been the author of its own misfortunes. The guarantee was the trigger, not the underlying cause. He was also critical of the regulators and due responsibility for insurance supervision had moved between departments over the relevant period, and the reporting regime did not require the guarantees to be shown in a way that made their potential cost visible. Nobody was looking at the right number, partly because the right number was not required to be published. A separate report by the Parliamentary Ombudsman went further, finding serial regulatory maladministration and recommending compensation. It took until 2010 for a compensation scheme to be established, and its scale was significantly smaller than policyholders had hoped. Many were, by then, elderly. Some had died waiting. Lay! So what actually went wrong here in mechanical terms? Because this is the part worth taking away. The first thing is that the guarantee was never priced. No explicit charge was made for it. No reserve was set aside against it. It was given away because, at the moment of giving, it appeared to cost nothing. And an obligation that costs nothing today can be enormous tomorrow if the conditions that made it free happen to change. The second is that the cost was invisible in the accounts for decades. This is not the same as being hidden. Nobody concealed it. The reporting conventions of the time simply did not require an insurer to state what its guarantees might cost under adverse conditions. So the number was not calculated, so nobody knew it. The third is that the trigger was not a disaster. It was a benign development. Falling inflation and rising life expectancy are both unambiguously good things. The institution was destroyed by good news arriving in a form its contracts had not anticipated. That is what makes this mechanism so much more dangerous than fraud. Fraud has a perpetrator, and perpetrators can be caught. This had no perpetrator. Every individual decision along the way was defensible, taken by competent people acting in good faith, and the aggregate was fatal. There is a fourth element, and it is structural. A mutual has no shock absorber. In a shareholder-owned insurer, a loss of this kind falls first on the shareholders. That is what shareholder capital is for. It sits between the liability and the customers. Equitable had no such layer. The membership was simultaneously the owner and the customer, so a loss to the company was immediately and directly a loss to the very people the company existed to serve. Mutuality had been the society's great virtue for 238 years. It became, in the space of a fortnight, the reason there was no one else to absorb the blow. It is worth being clear about what this episode did and did not prove, because it is often enlisted in arguments it does not really support. It did not prove that mutuals are inherently unsound. Plenty of mutuals have survived far worse and are still trading. It did not prove that guarantees are inherently reckless. Guarantees are the product in a great deal of insurance, and pricing them correctly is a solved problem. What it proved is narrower and more useful. An institution can be destroyed by an obligation that generates no cost, no cash flow, and no accounting entry for the entire period during which it is accumulating. The danger is not the promise. The danger is a promise nobody is required to measure. And that is not a historical curiosity. It is a live category. Defined. Benefit pension schemes across British industry carry exactly this shape of risk, a promise made decades ago against assumptions about returns and longevity that have since moved, sitting on the balance sheet of a company whose current business has nothing to do with it. Several substantial British firms now have pension liabilities larger than their market capitalisation. The promise was cheap when made and is not cheap now. Long-dated private finance contracts have the same structure. So does any commitment where the payer's obligation is fixed and the underlying cost is not. The tell in every case is the same. Look for an obligation that has been given away without an explicit price attached, whose cost depends on a variable outside anyone's control, and which does not currently appear in the accounts because it does not currently bind. Every one of those conditions was true of the guaranteed annuity rate in 1957 and remained true for 35 years. It is worth walking through the numbers, because the scale is what makes the mechanism vivid. When the guarantees were written, a typical guaranteed annuity rate might convert a pension fund at something in the region of 11%. That is, for every £100,000 accumulated, an income of around £11,000 a year for life. In the 1950s, that looked cautious, because market rates were higher and the guarantee would simply never be reached. By the late 1990s, the equivalent market annuity rate had fallen to roughly half that. So a policyholder with a guarantee was entitled to an income around twice what the same fund could actually purchase. Double, not a marginal advantage, a doubling, funded from a pool that had not set aside a penny against it. And the guarantees were concentrated. Around 90,000 policyholders held them, out of a membership approaching 1 million. So a tenth of the members held a claim that, if honoured in full, would consume a substantial fraction of the entire fund. That concentration is the reason the board reached for the terminal bonus in the first place. From where they sat, the alternative looked like 900,000 people paying for 90,000. Their solution was found to be unlawful, and rightly, but the problem they were trying to solve was real, and it had been created 40 years earlier by people who were no longer there. Now, the longevity side, which gets less attention and did comparable damage. When the annuity tables underlying those guarantees were constructed, a man retiring at 65 in Britain could expect to live roughly another 12 years. By the end of the century, that had risen to something closer to 17, and it has risen further since. An annuity is a promise to pay until death. 5 additional years of average life expectancy is not a 5% increase in cost. On a payment stream of that length, it is closer to 40%, and it applies to every single policy simultaneously. Insurers call this longevity risk, and the modern industry prices it explicitly, hedges it, and reserves against it. In 1957, it was not that it was mispriced. It was that it was not conceived of as a risk at all. Life expectancy had improved gradually and predictably for a century. There was no reason to imagine it would accelerate. So the two variables that determine the cost of the guarantee both moved adversely at the same time, for entirely unrelated reasons. One monetary, one medical, and neither had anything to do with how well the society was managed. There is a broader point buried in that which is worth stating plainly. Financial institutions are generally destroyed by things they were watching. A bank run is visible, a rogue trader is a person. A bubble is discussed in the newspapers for years before it bursts. In each case, The institution can at least be criticized for failing to act on information it had. Equitable was destroyed by two trends that were the subject of universal public celebration. Lower inflation and longer lives were the stated goals of government policy across the entire period. Nobody was going to warn an insurer about them because nobody classified them as dangers. Which brings us to the regulators and to a question that recurs whenever an institution fails. The supervisory regime for insurance in Britain over the relevant decades was, by modern standards, thin. Responsibility moved between the Department of Trade and Industry, the Treasury, and eventually the Financial Services Authority. Each handover involved a loss of institutional memory, and none of the successive regimes required an insurer to disclose the potential cost of its guarantees under adverse conditions. That last point is the substantive one. The regulators did not miss a number that was sitting in front of them. The number did not exist because nothing required it to be computed. Supervision consisted largely of confirming that the society met its statutory solvency margin, a calculation which, as constructed at the time, did not capture a guarantee that was not currently binding. Penrose was critical of this, and the parliamentary ombudsman more so, finding maladministration across multiple departments over more than a decade. But the criticism is not that officials were idle, it is that the entire reporting framework was built to answer a different question from the one that mattered. That is a failure of design rather than diligence, and it is a good deal harder to fix because you cannot design a disclosure regime around a risk nobody has yet identified as one. There is one more strand, and it is the one Penrose treated as the underlying cause rather than the trigger. For years before the guarantees crystallized, Equitable had been distributing more than it earned. A with-profits fund is meant to hold back surplus in strong years to support payouts in weak ones. That smoothing is the entire proposition. Equitable ran the policy unusually thin, declaring bonuses that its investment returns did not fully justify on the working assumption that future returns would make up the difference. That practice had a competitive logic. Published bonus rates were how with-profits funds were compared, and a fund declaring higher bonuses attracted more business. It also had a mutual logic. With no shareholders, the members were entitled to the surplus, and holding large reserves could be characterized as withholding members' own money from them. The consequence was a fund with very little spare capital at the precise moment it needed a great deal. Penrose's judgment was that this, more than the guarantee itself, is what made the society fragile. A better reserved insurer facing the same annuity liability would have been damaged. Equitable was destroyed. Several other British insurers had written comparable guarantees. Most survived because most had capital behind them, either shareholders or a more conservative bonus policy, or both. The guarantee was an industry-wide problem. Only one institution died of it. That comparison is the closest thing to a controlled experiment this episode offers, and it points firmly at reserving rather than at the promise. It is worth being precise about the human consequences too, because it is easy to discuss this as a balance sheet event. The 16% cut applied in July 2001 was not a paper adjustment. It reduced the value of the savings of people who were, in many cases, within a few years of retiring and who therefore had no time left to rebuild. Exit penalties meant that leaving to limit further losses cost money in itself. Policyholders found themselves choosing between two bad outcomes with no good one available. Equitable had been particularly strong among the professions: doctors, lawyers, academics, and a large number of the self-employed, for whom this was the whole of the pension provision rather than a supplement to an employer's scheme. The society's low charges and two-century reputation were exactly why careful, financially literate people had chosen it. There is no reading of this in which the victims were imprudent. The opposite is closer to the truth. The compensation story that followed took another decade. The Parliamentary Ombudsman reported in 2008 and recommended that policyholders be returned to the position they would have been in but for regulatory maladministration. The scheme, eventually established in 2010, was capped and paid a proportion of assessed losses rather than the whole. Successive governments faced the same arithmetic. Full restitution would have cost billions of public money for a private failure. Whatever view one takes of that decision, its practical effect was that a substantial part of the loss stayed where it landed, with the members. Now, what a modern insurer does differently, because the industry did learn. Guarantees of this kind are now valued explicitly using market-consistent methods, and the resulting figure appears on the balance sheet whether or not the guarantee currently binds. The regulatory regime requires firms to hold capital against adverse scenarios, not merely against current conditions. Longevity is modeled as a stochastic variable rather than a fixed table, and firms routinely transfer that risk to reinsurers through longevity swaps. None of that machinery existed when the promise was made. All of it exists substantially because this promise was made. That is the genuinely constructive legacy here. The modern discipline of valuing embedded options in insurance contracts, options being exactly what a guaranteed annuity rate is, was driven forward by the recognition that an institution could be destroyed by one that nobody had valued. There is a final detail worth sitting with. The guarantees were not exotic. They were not a derivative, not a structured product, not an instrument invented by clever people to be sold to less clever people. They were a plain sentence in a pension contract written in ordinary English, and their purpose was to protect the customer. Consider how it would have read to someone signing in 1960. A line confirming that whatever happened to the economy over the following 40 years, the rate at which their savings became a pension could not fall below a stated level. For a person who remembered the 1930s, that was not a technicality. It was the whole reason to trust an institution with money they would not see again for decades. The society was not being clever. It was answering the single most reasonable question a saver can ask, which is what happens if things go wrong, and it answered it honestly. The clause existed to make policyholders safer. It was inserted for their benefit, and it did precisely what it was designed to do. It held its value. When rates fell, it worked. That is the point. It worked exactly as intended, and the institution could not survive it working. That is a genuinely unsettling thought, and it is not one that appears in most accounts of financial failure, because most financial failures involve somebody doing something wrong. The Equitable Life Assurance Society was 238 years old when it stopped writing new business. It had survived the Napoleonic Wars, the Great Depression, 2 world wars, and the collapse of the empire it had insured. It had invented the actuarial mathematics that the entire industry still uses. And it was undone by one sentence: added when the risk was theoretical in a decade when nobody could imagine interest rates falling that far or people living that long. It is still in runoff in one form or another to this day. The remaining policies were transferred onward and the with-profits business wound down decades after the event, still settling obligations entered into before most of the people affected were born. There is one comparison worth making before the conclusion, because it shows how narrow the escape was elsewhere. Scottish Widows, Standard Life, Norwich Union, and several others had written guaranteed annuity rates on similar terms in the same decades. The industry-wide exposure ran into many billions. When rates fell, every one of those firms faced a version of the same bill. They handled it in three ways. Some had simply reserved against it, quietly, over years, treating the guarantee as a liability even while it was dormant. Some had shareholders who absorbed the hit, which is precisely the function shareholder capital performs. And some had been less generous with bonuses along the way, so there was a cushion in the fund itself. Equitable had none of the three. No reserve, because the guarantee had been treated as costless. No shareholders, because it was a mutual. No cushion, because bonus policy had been run to the edge for competitive reasons. Remove any one of those, and it probably survives. Remove all three, and there is nothing between the liability and the members. That is why this is a story about structure rather than about a clause. The clause was ordinary. The structural position it landed in was not. And it is worth naming the incentive that produced that position, because it was not irrationality. Every one of those three choices had a defensible rationale at the time it was made. Not reserving against a dormant guarantee looked like prudence, not recklessness. Reserving against something that had never once bound would have struck a 1970s actuary as needlessly locking up members' money. Mutuality was the society's proudest characteristic and the reason many members had joined. Generous bonuses were how a with-profits fund demonstrated it was serving its members well. Each decision was, in isolation, an expression of the same principle. This money belongs to the members, so give it to them rather than hoarding it. That principle is not wrong. It is arguably what a mutual is for. It simply happened to remove, one by one, every buffer the institution had. That is the pattern worth carrying away, and it is not confined to insurance. Organizations rarely fail because someone decides to take a large risk. They fail because a series of individually reasonable decisions, each justified by a sound principle, collectively remove the slack that would have absorbed a shock nobody predicted. Slack looks like waste right up until the moment it is the only thing that saves you. So, the useful question is not whether an institution is well run today. Equitable was well run for most of its life by careful people using mathematics it had invented itself. The question is what it has promised, to whom on terms that depend on something it does not control, and whether anybody has been made to write that number down. Because the guarantee that destroyed the oldest mutual in the world did not appear anywhere in its accounts for 35 years, and for 34 of them it was entirely free. One last thought about why this story is so rarely told, given how large it was. There is no villain in it, no arrest, no trial of any individual, no photograph of somebody leaving a building with a box of possessions. The House of Lords ruling is a careful piece of contractual reasoning about the limits of discretionary powers, which is not the stuff of headlines. The loss was spread thinly across 1 million people who mostly absorbed it privately. Financial history remembers the events that had faces. It forgets the ones that had only arithmetic. But the ones with only arithmetic are the ones most likely to happen again, precisely because there is no villain to watch for. You cannot regulate against good intentions, low inflation, and longer lives. You can only insist that somebody, somewhere, is required to write down what a promise might cost, and to keep writing it down in the decades when the answer is 0. And there is a reason that instruction sounds tedious. It is tedious. Writing down a number that has been 0 for 30 consecutive years every year feels like bureaucracy for its own sake, and the people doing it will reasonably ask what the point is. The point is that the discipline has to already exist on the day the number stops being 0. An organization that has never calculated a figure does not start calculating it. At the moment, it becomes alarming. It starts arguing about the methodology instead. And by then, the argument is about how large the hole is, rather than whether to dig one. Boring measurement, maintained through the decades when it reveals nothing, is the entire defense against this class of failure. There is no clever alternative.
In the year 1846, the British Parliament passed 272 separate acts authorizing the construction of new railways. 4,500 miles of new line were approved in that single year for a country about 600 miles long. The capital committed to railway schemes in the mid-1840s exceeded the annual income of the entire nation. At the peak, it is estimated that railway investment was absorbing money at a rate no private undertaking in human history had ever absorbed it. Clergymen invested, widows invested, the Bronte sisters invested, Charles Darwin invested. Members of Parliament invested in schemes they would then vote on in their hundreds, and nobody thought that remarkable enough to prevent. And standing at the centre of it all was a draper from York, a heavy, blunt, barely lettered businessman who at his height controlled nearly a third of the railway network of England, dined with royalty, commanded the largest private fortune machine in the country, and was known in every newspaper in Britain by a title no financier before him had ever carried. They called him the Railway King, and unlike most such titles, this one was not tabloid decoration. It described a real sovereignty over boards, over Parliament's railway committees, over the savings of a nation, and over the one number everyone watched, the price of his shares. For roughly 5 years, no private individual in Britain commanded more capital or more faith. Within 5 years of that peak, the schemes had collapsed, the shares had lost most of their value, a generation of middle-class savers had been ruined, many of them twice over, in a way we will explain, because the mechanism of their ruin is the most instructive part of this story, and the Railway King had been exposed, disgraced, and driven from the country he had briefly seemed to own. And yet, and this is what makes the railway mania unlike almost every other bubble this channel has covered, the railways got built. That is the strange, difficult heart of this story, and we will come back to it at the end. A speculative catastrophe that ruined its investors and endowed its country, a mania that functioned by accident as the most brutal infrastructure financing scheme ever devised. This is the story of the railway mania of the 1840s, the genuine miracle that started it, the machinery of scrip and calls that turned a nation into speculators, the man whose name was the market, and the crash that fell hardest on the people who could least afford it, including two sisters in a Yorkshire parsonage whose letters preserve the whole disaster in miniature. Start with the miracle, because every great mania begins with something true. A person born in Britain in 1800 entered a world that moved at the speed of a horse. Nothing on land had ever moved faster, not for the Romans, not for the Tudors, not for anyone. News, goods, armies, ideas, everything travelled at the pace of legs, hooves, and sails, as it had for the whole of human history. That person, at 30, could stand at a fence in Lancashire and watch the Liverpool and Manchester Railway open, the first true intercity line in the world, and see a machine pull a train of carriages at 30 miles an hour. By their 40s, expresses were approaching 60. In a single generation, the fundamental constant of human movement, unchanged for 10,000 years, had multiplied several times over. It is genuinely difficult, from inside our own century, to feel how violent that was. The railway did not improve the existing world, it replaced it. Journey times between cities fell from days to hours. Fresh food, daily newspapers, cheap coal, standardized time itself. The very clocks of England were synchronized because the trains demanded it. Nothing in the country was left untouched. And crucially, for our story, the early railways made money. Real money, openly declared. The Liverpool and Manchester paid dividends of 9 and 10% year after year at a time when government bonds paid 3. The Stockton and Darlington enriched its Quaker backers. The great trunk lines of the 1830s, the London and Birmingham, the Grand Junction, carried more traffic than their promoters had dared forecast. Hold that fact, because it is the seed of everything. This was not tulip bulbs, and it was not the South Sea. The technology was real, the transformation was real, and the profits, the early profits, were real and published. Every catastrophic mania this channel has covered contains a kernel of truth that made the first investors rich and the last investors certain. The dot-com crash had the internet. Enron had a genuinely brilliant gas business. The railway mania had the most transformative machine of the 19th century, visibly coining money. The lesson people took from the 1830s was simple, reasonable, and lethal. Railways pay. Now the machinery, because a mania needs more than a story. It needs a mechanism that lets ordinary people bet more than they have, and the 1840s built a beautiful one. You could not simply build a railway in Britain. Every line needed its own Act of Parliament, powers to compulsorily purchase land, to cross roads and rivers, to exist as a company. So the sequence ran like this. A group of promoters, engineers, lawyers, local worthies, sometimes chancers with nothing but a map and a name, formed a provisional committee. They published a prospectus, the route, the traffic estimates, the glorious future, and they invited the public to subscribe for shares. Here is the crucial detail, the same detail, you may notice, that sat inside our Overend Gurney story, wearing different clothes. You did not pay for your shares. You paid a deposit, typically around 5%, and received scrip, a certificate entitling you to the shares when called upon to pay the rest, installment by installment, as construction proceeded. Run the arithmetic on what that means. With £50, a person could take up £1,000 of railway shares. If the scheme was popular and the scrip rose to a premium, as scrip in a hot market reliably did, they could sell the certificate itself, never paying another instalment, and pocket the difference. A clerk with modest savings could deal in thousands of pounds of nominal capital on a deposit in an instrument that traded like cash. That is leverage, margin trading in modern language, offered to the whole literate public of Britain, decades before anyone had invented the vocabulary to warn them. The scrip system converted a nation of savers into a nation of speculators, and it did so through an instrument that felt, in the rising market of 1844 and 1845, like a machine for free money. Buy the allotment, watch the premium, sell to the next man. The practice even had a name, stagging, and respectable people did it who would have been horrified to be called gamblers. But remember what the scrip actually was, because everyone holding it chose to forget. It was not an asset. It was a contract to pay the remaining 95% on demand whenever the company called for it. Every certificate in every drawer in England was a debt wearing an asset's clothing. We will meet those calls again. Now add the gatekeepers and watch each one fail in turn. Parliament was the sieve through which every scheme had to pass, and Parliament was invested. By the height of the Mania, members holding railway shares or seats on railway boards numbered in the hundreds. The committees scrutinizing railway bills were substantially manned by men with money in railways. Schemes multiplied because approval multiplied, and approval multiplied because the approvers were shareholders. Nobody had to be corrupt in the envelope of cash sense for that to end badly. The conflict did the work all by itself, as it did at Enron's auditor, as it did with the analysts of the dot-com years. A check that profits from the boom does not check the boom. The press did no better. The newspapers of the 1840s swelled with railway advertising, prospectus after prospectus, page after page, at premium rates. Whole new papers existed for nothing else. At the peak, there were more than a dozen railway journals. The Times, to its credit, thundered warnings about the Mania, while collecting a fortune in railway advertisement revenue with the other hand. The information system the public relied on was being paid handsomely by the thing it was supposed to appraise. And the government? The Board of Trade made one serious attempt to impose order, a committee to evaluate schemes on their merits. And it was overwhelmed and effectively swept aside in 1845. There was no other regulator. There was no companies' legislation worth the name, no accounting standards, no audit profession. The investing public of the 1840s walked into the largest capital market event in history, protected by nothing but their own judgment and the honor of promoters. Pause here and take stock of the architecture before the king enters, because the Mania of 1845 was, structurally, a perfect machine with every safety removed. A genuinely transformative technology with published profits to prove it. A leveraged instrument, the scrip, placing that story within reach of every purse in Britain, at 20-to-1 gearing nobody thought of as gearing. Gatekeepers, Parliament, press, profession, each compensated by the boom they were supposed to police. No accounting standards, no audit, no disclosure law, nothing between a promoter's arithmetic and a widow's legacy, but the promoter's conscience. And a public whose only financial education was the observable fact that everyone who had bought railway shares so far had won. Every mania this channel has covered assembles some of those parts. The 1840s assembled all of them at once, in the largest economy on Earth, around the most important invention of the age. The only thing missing was a face, a single name to carry the public's faith, as names carried it at Overend, Gurney, and at Enron. History supplied one within the year. Into this world came George Hudson. He was not a gentleman and never pretended to be. A draper's apprentice from York, who inherited an unexpected fortune, he put it into the infant York railway schemes in the 1830s and discovered in himself an extraordinary talent, not for engineering, which he never understood, but for amalgamation. Where others promoted single lines, Hudson bought, merged, leased, and consolidated them into systems. The Midland Railway, one of the great companies of English history, was assembled by Hudson out of squabbling fragments. By the late 1840s, the companies he chaired controlled something approaching a third of the network then running. And he understood, before almost anyone, the single most important fact of the share mania. The price of the shares was the business. Keep the dividend high and the share price follows. Keep the share price high and new capital flows in. Keep the capital flowing and you can build, buy, and absorb everything in reach. So Hudson paid magnificent dividends. Through the mania years, his companies paid out at rates that made them the blue chips of the boom, and the money to pay them came, in substantial part, not from the traffic revenues of the railways, but from capital, from the new subscriptions, from the installments paid in by new shareholders, recycled to the old ones as though it were profit. Say it plainly, dividends were being paid out of the shareholders' own money to sustain the share price, to attract more shareholders whose money paid the next dividend. If you have watched our Madoff episode, the shape of that sentence is familiar. But mark the difference too, because it matters for the trial of history. Madoff ran no business at all. There were no trades, only the recycling. Hudson ran real railways, carrying real passengers, earning real revenue, just not enough of it, and papered the gap from capital in accounts that no law then required to be true, audited by nobody, in an era whose accounting had no settled rules to break. Whether that makes him a fraud or merely the most aggressive accountant of a lawless age was argued furiously then, and is argued by historians still. We will let the record speak, and you may judge. What is beyond dispute is the scale of the worship while it lasted. Hudson became MP for Sunderland. He bought one of the grandest houses in London and entertained dukes in it. Prince Albert came to dinner. York, his city, hung on his word. A street was named for him. A public subscription was raised to honour him, and subscribers included half of respectable England. When Hudson joined aboard, the shares rose on his name alone. Like the Quaker name at Overend, Gurney, like the fortune covers at Enron, his reputation had become a financial instrument in its own right, collateral that everyone accepted and no one could inspect. By 1845, the mania was at full roar. Over 1,000 new schemes were projected in that year alone. Lines to everywhere. Lines duplicating lines. Lines to places whose whole population could have fitted in one train. Subscription lists filled with signatures that ranged from dukes to domestic servants. Investigators later found subscribers who had pledged sums vastly beyond their entire worth on deposits borrowed at interest. And in a parsonage on the Yorkshire moors, the Bronte sisters held shares in the York and North Midland, a Hudson company. The detail is small and perfect, which is why we pause on it. The sisters' aunt had left them a modest legacy, the only capital 3 clergymen's daughters would ever have. Emily managed the investments, and through the boom years the railway shares swelled. Charlotte, the eldest, watched the market with a cool eye that her letters preserve. She thought the shares had risen beyond reason, expected the reckoning, and proposed selling while the premium lasted. Emily would not, and Charlotte, deferring to her sister rather than to her own judgment, let it lie, writing with resignation that she would rather lose the money than quarrel over it. Keep those 3 women in view. They are who a mania actually happens to, not the stags and promoters, but households holding their one legacy in the fashionable security of the day, half knowing better, staying in because selling felt like a betrayal of the general faith. Multiply the parsonage by 100,000 parlours, and you have the real ledger of 1845. Before the turn, 3 more pieces of the world of 1845 deserve their place. The war inside the boom, the men who actually built the thing, and the sheer texture of a country gone railway mad, because the mania was not only a market, it was a civilization, briefly. First, the war. Not every railway was the same railway, because Britain's 2 great engineering camps had built to different gauges, the width between the rails. George Stephenson's lines and most of the country ran on 4 feet 8.5 inches, a dimension inherited with perfect English logic from colliery tramways. Isambard Kingdom Brunel, building the Great Western, had chosen 7 feet, a broad gauge for speed, stability, and grandeur, and incompatible with everything else. Where the 2 systems met, at places like Gloucester, every passenger and every ton of freight had to be unloaded, carried across a platform, and reloaded, chaos so notorious that it became a national joke and a parliamentary scandal. In 1846, the same Parliament, waving through those 272 acts, also passed the Gauge Act, siding with Stephenson's dimension for the future. Brunel's magnificent outlier was slowly converted over the following decades, and the width of a Northumbrian coal cart became, in time, the standard gauge of most of the railways on Earth, one of history's great examples of an accident becoming an infrastructure, locked in not because it was best, but because it was first and most connected. Investors' note bore the cost of that war too. Duplicate lines were promoted purely as gauge strategy, to seize territory for one camp before the other arrived. Mileage justified by geopolitics rather than traffic, paid for by shareholders who thought they were buying dividends. Second, the navvies, because every pound of that scorched capital was converted into earthworks by human muscle, and the scale of it has no modern equivalent. At the height of construction, the railway workforce approached 250,000 men, the largest concentration of labour in the country, larger than the army and navy together. They dug the cuttings with picks and barrows, drove the tunnels by candlelight through rock and running sand, raised the great viaducts arch by arch, essentially without machinery, at a pace that still astonishes engineers. They were itinerant, hard-living, largely Irish and Northern English, camped in shanty settlements that trailed the works across the shires, feared by respectable villages and indispensable to them. They were also expendable in a way the ledgers never recorded. Deaths and maimings on the great works ran at rates no modern project would survive a week of. The Woodhead Tunnel alone became a byword, with casualty rates compared at the time bitterly to a battlefield. No memorial fund appeared in any prospectus. When the calls stopped and the capital dried in 1847 and 1848, tens of thousands of them were simply turned off, mid-country, wageless, the first and least remembered casualties of the crash, ruined not by shares they never owned, but by the sudden stop of the money that had employed them. Any honest account of the Mania keeps them in the frame. The speculation was paper, but it was cashed in shoulders and lungs. And third, the texture of the madness itself, because the documents of 1845 read like satire and are not. Subscription lists, the signed pledges behind each scheme, demanded by Parliament, were found on examination to include charwomen down for thousands, clerks pledging multiples of their lifetime earnings, names copied from directories, and in the famous cases, men of straw signed up by promoters at so much a signature to swell the list. Punch lived on the Mania for 2 years. Clergymen preached against railway gambling to congregations who held scrip in their hymn books. Provincial share exchanges sprang up in a dozen towns to trade paper that London had never heard of. And letters of the period record the detail that always marks a top in every era: servants, apprentices, and schoolboys discussing premiums, the moment, as a later American put it, of 1929, when the shoeshine boy gives you stock tips. When the whole of society is in the market, there is no one left to buy from the last man in. The Mania of 1845 discovered that theorem empirically, and 1847 published the proof. The turn, when it came the way it usually comes, not with a thunderclap, but with a change in the price of money. Through 1845 and 1846, the Bank of England's rate began to rise. Money tightened. And now the beautiful machine of the scrip system went into reverse, because the railways, thousands of miles of them now authorized by all those acts, had to actually be built, and building meant calling up the capital. The calls went out. Pay up the next installment on your shares, then the next. Through 1846, 1847, 1848, the demands arrived by post in their hundreds of thousands, printed forms with a company seal, a sum and a date, each one enforceable at law against everything the holder owned. Contemporaries called the drumbeat of them simply the calls, the way one speaks of the weather. Diaries of the period record households opening the morning's letters in genuine dread. Landowners had to be paid, navvies waged, iron bought, the Mania's paper had to be converted into cuttings and viaducts, and the only source was the shareholders' pockets, exactly as the scrip contracts had always said. Understand the trap closing, because this is the mechanism that made 1847 so much crueler than an ordinary crash. In an ordinary crash, your shares fall and your loss is what you paid. In the railway crash, your shares fell and you still owed the company the unpaid 90-odd% in cash, on schedule, enforceable at law. Selling was no escape once premiums vanished. Scrip at a discount still carried its calls. Families sold houses to meet calls on shares worth a fraction of the sums still owed on them. The instrument that had let a clerk command £1,000 with 50 now presented the bill for the other 950 in the middle of a slump, with the asset itself collapsing. If you watched our Lloyd's episode or our Overend Gurney episode, you have now seen this creature 3 times in 3 costumes: the unlimited name, the uncalled bank share, the part-paid scrip. Every era offers ordinary people an instrument that pays like an asset in good times and turns into a debt in bad ones, and every era's saver's sign, because the calm years have priced the signature at 0. It is the single most reliable ruin machine in financial history, and it is never called a loan. Then, 1847 delivered the general crisis: bad harvests, dear corn, gold draining abroad, the money market seizing. And in the autumn came a full commercial panic, banks and merchant houses failing, the Bank Charter Act suspended for the first time ever, 19 years before Overend Gurney forced the same measure. Railway shares, already sliding for a year, went over the cliff. By 1849, the great index of railway property had fallen by more than half from the peak. The marginal schemes were dead entirely, their deposits gone. Dividends across the network sank toward 2 and 3%, bond returns for equity risk on capital that could not be recovered. The Brontes' shares duly collapsed. Charlotte's letters from 1849 record it without self-pity. The money, she wrote, was probably lost, and many, she added, with her novelist's eye, had lost far more, those who had ventured what they could not afford on calls they could not meet. By then, she had other griefs. Emily, who would not sell, was dead at 30, and the shares outlived her judgment only to vindicate her sisters. A small story, it stood and stands for 100,000 like it. And the Railway King? For Hudson, the falling market was the one enemy his method could not survive, because his method, at bottom, required rising subscriptions to pay the dividends that kept the subscriptions rising. Through 1848, the machine strained. In early 1849, it broke. A shareholder at one of his companies pressed awkward questions about shares Hudson had transferred. Committees of investigation were appointed at the Midland, at the York, and North Midland, at the eastern counties. And what they found, company by company, was the same. Dividends declared out of capital, accounts adjusted to suit, balances that existed on paper and nowhere else, and benefits to the chairman that had gone unrecorded and unexplained. The fall was total and swift in the way only the fall of an idol can be. The dukes vanished. The subscription monument was quietly abandoned. York struck his name where it could. He was pursued for enormous restitution, lost his fortune, lost his seat eventually, fled to the continent to keep ahead of arrest for debt, and was for a time imprisoned in York, the city that had worshipped him when he ventured back. He died in London in 1871, in modest lodgings, maintained at the end by a small fund raised by old railway hands who remembered whatever else that he had built more of England than any man alive. Sit for a moment with the strangest scene of the fall, because contemporaries recorded it with something like awe. Through the winter of 1848 into 1849, Hudson still came to the House of Commons, A member could not be arrested for debt while Parliament protected him, and everyone knew that was partly why he came. The man who had been mobbed by admirers now walked the lobbies alone. Members who had begged for allotments in his companies, who had dined at Albert Gate and voted his bills through committee, looked through him as he passed. Nobody in the chamber had clean hands. The whole house had feasted on the Mania, and so the house did what implicated institutions do. It isolated the symbol and forgot its own subscription lists. Hudson bore it by all accounts without complaint and without apology, insisting to the end of his life that he had done as railwaymen did, only larger, that he had made money for thousands before he lost it, and that the rules he was condemned under had not existed when he acted. It is self-serving, and it is not entirely false, and holding both of those in mind at once is precisely the discipline this channel keeps asking of you. There is also the question of what happened to the wreckage, because 1,000 dead schemes do not simply vanish, they get digested. Through the 1850s, the survivors consolidated. The strong companies absorbed the broken ones at right-down prices, rationalized the duplicate routes the gauge war and the Mania had spawned, and settled into the handful of great territorial systems, Midland, Great Western, London and Northwestern, Northeastern, that ran Britain's railways for the next 70 years. Investors who had bought at the top and somehow held through the ruin saw dividends recover slowly to modest respectability by the late 1850s. The network's traffic doubled and doubled again. In other words, the assets were good all along, at a third of the price. The Mania had not invented value that did not exist, like the South Sea. It had paid 3 times too much for value that did, and the difference between those two eras is the difference between nothing and a nation's infrastructure, purchased at a generation's expense. And the reckoning reshaped the law, in the slow British way, not in one great statute, but in a chain of them, each patching the hole the last disaster had found. The Companies Acts of the 1850s and 1860s built the modern limited company. Railway regulation acquired teeth by degrees, and the profession of the independent auditor, men whose whole trade was verifying that a declared dividend had actually been earned, grew up in the direct shadow of the Hudson revelations, staffed at first by the very accountants who had untangled his books. It is a pattern you will recognize from every episode in this series. Sarbanes-Oxley is a portrait of Enron, the lender of last resort is a portrait of Overend Gurney, and the Victorian audit is a portrait of the Railway King. Financial law is not designed. It is accreted, each layer the fossil of a specific catastrophe laid down while the wreck was still smoking. He was never criminally tried. As with the Overend directors, as at Enron, the line between catastrophic concealment and provable crime ran through territory the law of his day could not map. Much of what he did broke standards that were only written because of him. The Companies Acts, the slow invention of compulsory audit, the very idea that a public company's accounts must be true. The reforms of the following decades are, in large part, a portrait of George Hudson drawn in statute. Set the fall of Hudson beside the 2 other fallen names this channel has studied, and the pattern completes itself. The Quaker partners of Overend Gurney spent an inherited reputation and were acquitted. Hudson spent a self-made one and was never charged. The executives of Enron spent an institutional one, and a century and a half later, finally went to prison, not because their conduct was worse, but because Hudson's disasters had, by then, built the laws to catch it. Each scandal purchases the statute that convicts its successor. That is the grim gift each generation of the ruined leaves the next, and it is why the study of these old collapses is not antiquarianism. The rules that protect your pension were written, clause by clause, in the wreckage of other peoples. And note what all three names had in common at their height. Each had become, functionally, a substitute for analysis. It's a Hudson line. Overend holds the paper. Enron's in the deal. In every case, the name ended the conversation that due diligence should have started. That was precisely its economic function, the reason it commanded a premium. A name that cannot be questioned is not a reputation. It is a blindfold rented by the hour, and the rent is collected at the end. So, the reckoning. Who paid and what was bought? The investors paid, above all the small ones, ruined by the double blade of falling shares and rising calls. Contemporary estimates put the capital sunk into railways by 1850 at a sum approaching £250 million, a figure vast beyond modern conversion, committed by hundreds of thousands of households, earning at the bottom returns of 2 or 3%. A decade of middle-class saving had been converted at ruinous personal cost into iron and earthworks. But here is the twist we promised, the one that separates this mania from every other in the catalogue. The iron and earthworks were real. Britain came out of the mania with 6,000 miles of working railway, the trunk network, substantially, that the country still uses. The cuttings your train runs through today, the viaducts, the great curves of line across the Pennines and the Shires, dug by hand by armies of navvies and paid for by the scorched savings of the 1840s. The South Sea Company left nothing. The tulip contracts left nothing. The railway mania left the circulatory system of the modern British economy. Cheap coal, cheap food, national markets, the platform for 50 years of industrial supremacy. Nothing else in the history of speculation has this shape at this scale. A bubble whose residue was not paper, but permanent works, still earning their keep 2 centuries on. Economists have a wry name for the pattern, the mania as financing mechanism. It appears again in our own era. The dot-com crash bankrupted the speculators and left behind the fiber optic network the internet then ran on cheaply for decades. Sometimes a bubble is how a society tricks itself into paying for infrastructure no rational investor would fund, with the cost falling, brutally and by lottery, on whoever happened to hold the paper when the music stopped. Whether that is a defense of manias or the darkest thing about them, we leave with you. The Brontes were not consoled by the timetables. So, what should we take from the railway mania? 4 things. First, a preliminary that frames the other 4. Notice how long the whole cycle took. From the Liverpool and Manchester's opening to the peak of the mania, 15 years. From peak to ruin, 2. From ruin back to quiet prosperity on the same assets, 10 more. A full generation's arc, which is precisely why the lessons never hold, because the people who learn them retire, and the asset that ruined their parents becomes, to their children, simply the boring old railway that always pays. Financial memory is not lost. It dies of old age, on schedule, roughly every 25 years. Mark the interval between 1846 and every mania since, and you will find the rhythm disquietingly steady. Now the lessons proper. The most dangerous bubbles grow on true stories. Everyone remembers to laugh at tulips. Nobody was ruined by doubting them. It is the real revolution, the railway, the internet, the genuine gas bank at the heart of Enron, that disarms skepticism, because the early doubters are proved wrong publicly year after year until doubt itself sounds like ignorance. When the underlying thing is real, the only question left is price, and price is exactly what a mania cannot see. Is it real? Is the wrong question in every boom. The question is, what am I paying for it, and what am I obliged to pay later? Second, find the instrument that turns into a debt. Every mania has one. Ask of any investment offered to you what the part-paid scrip holders of 1846 did not ask. What is the worst thing this piece of paper can require of me, and when would it require it? If the answer is more money precisely when everything is falling, you are not holding an asset with a downside. You are holding someone else's option on your solvency. Third, count the conflicted gatekeepers. Parliament held the shares it approved. The press sold the advertisements it should have doubted. There was no auditor to buy. When every checker profits from the boom, the absence of warnings is not evidence of safety. It is evidence of the conflict. The reforms that followed, company law, audit, disclosure, are the institutional memory of this lesson. They decay and are relearned roughly once a century. And fourth, the dividend is the last thing to trust. Hudson's empire was held aloft for years by the one number every investor watched and no law verified. Income can be imagined, accounts can be dressed, but a fat dividend feels like truth arriving in cash, even when it is your own capital or the next subscribers coming back to you with a bow on it. From Hudson to Madoff, the steady payout is the confidence trick's favorite costume for the excellent reason that it works. And one more figure deserves his footnote before we close, because he is the mania's control experiment. The man who looked at 1845 and said no. The Glen Mutchkin Railway, a savage satire published at the boom's height, imagined two chances floating a line through an empty Highland glen and being buried in subscriptions. Its author, a sharp-eyed lawyer, meant it as a warning, and investors read it as a prospectus. It sold out. That is worth a moment's genuine awe. The mania was warned, repeatedly, wittily, in its own newspapers, by its own writers. The Times thundered, Punch mocked, the satire named the tricks, and the warnings changed nothing, because a warning cannot compete with a neighbor's visible profits. Nobody in a mania lacks information. What they lack is the willingness to be the one fool standing out of the market while fools are being paid. Cassandra's problem was never her accuracy. The parsonage at Haworth is a museum now. The Midland Main Line still runs. Somewhere between those two facts lies the whole moral of the 1840s. A nation's savings turned to smoke and to steel in the same transaction, and a king whose only throne, all along, had been the willingness of strangers to believe the number beside his name. Sources and method. This account draws on the parliamentary record of the Railway Acts of the Mania years and the reports of the Committees of Investigation into the Hudson Companies of 1849, the contemporary reporting of the Times, the Economist and the Railway Press, the published letters of Charlotte Bronte concerning the York and North Midland shares, the sums and returns recorded in the standard economic histories of the Mania and the crisis of 1847, and the scholarly literature on George Hudson, on which opinion remains genuinely divided. Where the record is contested, above all how far Hudson knowingly deceived as against operating aggressively in an age without accounting rules, a question his investigators struggled with and historians still do, this video presents the evidence and the defense together. Figures for capital committed, mileage authorized, and dividend collapse are given as contemporaries, and later historians record them, rounded rather than falsely precise.